Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a comprehensive and peaceful journey through the complete life of Harthacnut, the last Danish king to rule over England, whose troubled reign from 1040 to 1042 marked the final fading chapter of Viking rule over the English kingdom and the end of his father's great North Sea empire. We'll softly explore every stage of this complex monarch's journey, from his extraordinary birth as the legitimate heir to the mighty North Sea empire that connected England, Denmark and Norway under one crown, to his lonely and formative childhood, spent ruling Denmark as a boy under the watchful eyes of ambitious regents, and to his anguished years trapped in Scandinavia while his half-brother stole his English throne and murdered his beloved brother Alfred, and finally to his brief but notorious reign in England, where crushing taxation, brutal vengeance, and harsh autocratic rule turned his subjects against him, before his life ended suddenly and mysteriously at a wedding celebration. All while the great powers of medieval Europe shifted and transformed around him, and the Viking Age itself drew toward its inevitable close. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about what you'd like to learn in future episodes of Sleepy Crown, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way night after night. So, cozy up beneath your blankets, close your eyes, I'll let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow these gentle whispers from the 11th century to lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family, where history becomes a lullaby. Harthacnut, later known as King Harthacnut of Denmark and England, the last Danish monarch to wear the English crown, entered this world in the year 1018, or perhaps in the late summer of 1017, during a time when the cold, grey waters of the North Sea served not as a barrier between kingdoms, but as a highway connecting them, when Viking longships could carry warriors and traders from Scandinavia to the British Isles in a matter of days, given favourable winds, and when the great powers of Northern Europe were being reshaped by conquest and marriage into a new order that would have seemed impossible just a generation earlier. His very name, Harthacnut, which comes from the Old Norse words meaning tough knot or hard knot, would prove strangely, eerily prophetic, for his entire life would indeed be like a tangled knot, impossibly complex, bound up in the intricate and often violent politics of not one kingdom but three, England, Denmark and Norway, realms that his father had lashed together through force of arms and diplomatic marriages, creating what historians would later call the North Sea Empire. Yet this knot, seemingly so strong when tied by his father's powerful hands, would prove unable to hold once those hands were stilled by death. The ties would loosen, the strands would fray, and by the time Harthacnut himself died at the shockingly young age of 23 or 24, the entire construction would unravel completely and never to be reassembled. The child who would become England's last Danish king entered this world in circumstances of truly extraordinary privilege and power, born into the very pinnacle of 11th century European royalty. His father was none other than Cnut the Great, sometimes called Cnut in English sources, one of only two English monarchs in the entire sweep of English history ever to bear the magnificent epithet the Great, the other being Alfred, that Saxon hero who had fought off the Viking invasions of the 9th century. At the precise moment of Harthacnut's birth, Cnut ruled as King of England, having conquered that ancient realm through a brutal campaign of invasion and war that had culminated in his final victory just 2 years earlier, in 1016. But England was only the beginning of Cnut's ambitions. His dominions would eventually grow to encompass not only England, but also Denmark, the homeland of his ancestors, and Norway, that fierce northern kingdom of fjords and forests. He would even claim authority over parts of Sweden and other territories along the Baltic coast, creating what historians now call the North Sea Empire, a maritime realm unlike anything Northern Europe had seen before, a personal union of kingdoms that stretched from the Arctic Circle in the north to the English Channel in the south, connected by the ships and sailors who could navigate those dangerous northern waters. Harthacnut's mother was Emma of Normandy, a woman whose own story reads like something plucked from the pages of legend or epic poetry, so extraordinary were the twists and turns of her life. And Emma had first come to England as a very young bride in the spring of 1002, brought across the Channel from Normandy to marry King Ethelred the Unready, the Anglo-Saxon monarch who was struggling desperately and mostly unsuccessfully to defend his kingdom against wave after wave of Viking raids and invasions. Ethelred was already middle-aged when he married the teenage Emma, and he already had numerous children from his first marriage to a woman named Elfgifu of York. Emma bore him more children, including 2 sons who would both play crucial roles in our story. Edward, who would later be known as Edward the Confessor, and would eventually become one of England's most venerated kings and saints, and Alfred, whose terrible fate we will encounter later in this tale. But Emma's first marriage would end in tragedy and upheaval. When the great Viking warrior Sweyn Forkbeard launched a massive invasion of England in 1013, driving Ethelred into exile, Emma and her children were sent to Normandy for safety. Ethelred managed to return to England after Sweyn's sudden death in 1014, but he himself died just 2 years later in 1016, worn out by years of war and stress, leaving England to be contested between his sons and the invading Danes, led by Sweyn's son, Cnut. And then Emma made a choice that scandalized many of her contemporaries, but which proved her remarkable political intelligence and her instinct for survival. When Cnut emerged victorious as the undisputed King of England in late 1016, having defeated all rival claimants including Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside, Emma agreed to marry him. She married Cnut, the very man who had conquered England and displaced her first husband's dynasty, the Danish warlord who had led armies that had burned English villages and monasteries. She became his queen in 1017, transforming herself from the widow of the conquered Anglo-Saxon king into the wife of the triumphant Viking conqueror, securing her position in the new order that was rapidly taking shape, and ensuring that she would remain Queen of England regardless of which dynasty sat on the throne. The marriage between Cnut and Emma was far more than a simple union of convenience or a cold political calculation, though politics certainly played its essential part in the arrangement. According to the encomium Emmae Reginae, which translates from the Latin as in praise of Queen Emma, a flattering and carefully crafted biography that Emma herself would later commission and pay for, written by a monk whose name has not survived the centuries, Cnut had agreed to a crucially important condition before their wedding ceremony took place. Any sons born of their marriage together would take absolute precedence in the line of succession over any sons that Cnut had fathered in previous relationships. This was no small or trivial matter, for Cnut had another woman in his life before Emma, a woman named Elfgifu of Northampton, who was either his first wife in a Danish marriage ceremony, or perhaps his mistress or handfast wife. The exact nature of their relationship remains somewhat unclear and disputed by historians. What is certain is that Elfgifu had already given Cnut sons, including one named Svein and another named Harold, who would later become known by the nickname Harold Harefoot, supposedly because of his remarkable speed and skill as a hunter and runner. Little Harthacnut then was born with what we might call the golden spoon of legitimate succession, firmly and securely placed in his mouth from the very moment he drew his first breath. He was not merely another king's son among many, not just one more princeling hoping to inherit something someday if fortune smiled upon him. No, he was specifically designated, explicitly marked out as the legitimate heir to multiple crowns, the specially chosen child through whom two great dynasties, the Norman ducal house from which his mother Emma descended, and the Danish royal line that had produced his father Cnut, would be united and joined together in perpetuity. His mother Emma already had children from her first marriage to Ethelred, those two boys named Edward and Alfred, whom we mentioned earlier, who had been sent away across the Channel to Normandy for their own safety when Cnut took the throne, for it would have been far too dangerous for them to remain in England, where they might become focal points for rebellion against the new Danish king. But Harthacnut was fundamentally different from his half-brothers. He was the living bridge between the old Anglo-Saxon world that had existed before the conquest and the new Viking order that was now taking shape. The breathing symbol made flesh of Cnut's complete victory and his successful integration into English royalty and legitimacy. The England into which Harthacnut was born had been utterly transformed by his father's invasion and ultimate victory over all rivals. For more than 2 long and terrible centuries, beginning in the late 8th century with the shocking raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, wave after wave after wave of Viking raiders had struck at the British Isles with devastating and terrifying regularity. Their distinctive dragon-prowed ships would appear suddenly on the horizon, emerging from the morning mist, or rounding a headland without warning, bringing fire and sword and death to monasteries rich with treasures and gold, to undefended villages whose inhabitants had no chance against trained warriors, to churches where monks prayed, to farms where families worked the land. The names that later historians would give to this period: the Viking Age, the Age of the Northmen, the time of the pagans, all speak to the terror and complete upheaval that those centuries had brought to the peoples of Britain, Ireland, France and beyond. But Cnut represented something genuinely different from the raiders and pirates who had come before him. He was not a raider seeking quick plunder to carry back to Scandinavia. He was not a pirate captain looking to steal what he could and disappear before defenders could organize. He was not a destroyer who burned and killed for the sheer savage joy of it. No, Cnut was a ruler, a king, a builder of institutions and systems of government. He married into English royalty rather than simply conquering and ruling by force alone. He generously patronized the Christian church and giving gifts to monasteries and cathedrals, attending religious services, presenting himself as a pious Christian king rather than a pagan Viking warlord. He upheld and enforced English law rather than replacing it wholesale with Danish customs. He worked consciously and deliberately to create a unified realm that honored both the ancient Anglo-Saxon traditions that stretched back centuries to the migrations of Germanic tribes after the fall of Rome, and the newer Scandinavian power and culture that the Vikings had brought with them across the seas. As a small child, barely able to walk and talk, Harthacnut would have been dimly aware, in the limited way that small children can comprehend such vast concepts, of his father's immense authority and power. The royal court moved between various locations throughout England, following the medieval custom of itinerant kingship, where the king travelled constantly from estate to estate, consuming the food and resources of each location before moving on to the next. But Winchester, that ancient capital of the old kingdom of Wessex, with its magnificent cathedral that housed the bones of saints and its royal treasury, where the kingdom's wealth was stored and guarded, served as something like a permanent capital, the place where the king would return again and again. Here, in Winchester's royal halls, young Harthacnut would have witnessed firsthand the elaborate ceremony and carefully staged pageantry of kingship, all designed to impress and overawe observers with the majesty of royal power. He would have seen the endless stream of nobles and bishops and abbots and merchants seeking audience with his father and waiting patiently or impatiently in antechambers for their chance to present petitions or complaints or requests for justice. He would have watched the guards in their ringmail shirts, hauberks made of thousands of interlocking iron rings, laboriously crafted by skilled armourers, standing at attention with spears and swords, ready to defend their king and his family. He would have observed the scribes and clerks preparing documents in Latin, the language of learning and the church, and in Old English, the language of law and administration, their quill pens scratching carefully across precious parchment made from treated animal skins. He would have heard the chink and clatter of silver coins being counted and stacked, coins being struck at royal mints scattered throughout the kingdom, each bearing his father's image and name, Cnut Rex, proclaiming to anyone who handled them that Cnut was king, legitimate ruler of England by right of conquest and acceptance. In the month of June in the year 1023, when Harthacnut was only about 5 years old, still very much a small child by any measure, he participated in an important religious and political event that his biographer, the modern historian Ian Howard, who has written the definitive scholarly book about Harthacnut's life and reign, has identified as highly significant in marking out the young prince's status and position. Together with his mother Emma, the young prince played a prominent and leading role in the solemn translation, the formal ceremonial movement, of the body of St. Elfhere from the Church of St. Paul in London, where it had rested for 11 years, to Canterbury Cathedral, the mother church of all England and the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest-ranking churchman in the kingdom. St. Elfhere had been Archbishop of Canterbury before being captured and martyred by Viking raiders in a particularly brutal fashion back in 1012, just a few years before Harthacnut's birth. The raiders had taken the elderly archbishop prisoner and held him for ransom, but Elfhere had refused to allow the ransom to be paid, saying that the money should go to feed the poor rather than to enrich his captors. Enraged by his defiance and reportedly very drunk, the Vikings had pelted him with bones left over from their feasting and finally killed him with an axe blow to the head. His death had shocked Christian England and Scandinavia both, and his remains were considered precious and powerful relics, and capable of performing miracles and interceding with God on behalf of those who prayed to him. The fact that little Harthacnut, so terribly young that he must have been led through the ceremonies by adults guiding his every step, was given such a prominent and visible role in this important religious ceremony, was seen by contemporary observers, and has been interpreted by modern historians as a clear signal, a deliberate public statement. This child was being marked out, singled out, designated before all the world as his father's chosen heir in England, the future king who would one day rule in his father's place. But Cnut's empire was vast beyond imagining for most people of that era, who typically never travelled more than a few miles from the villages where they were born. Ruling such far-flung territories required constant attention, high endless vigilance, and the delegation of authority to trusted representatives. Denmark, the heartland of Cnut's family's power, the kingdom from which his grandfather Harold Bluetooth and father Swine Forkbeard had ruled, faced serious and ongoing threats from ambitious neighbours who saw opportunity in Cnut's focus on England. Norway, rich in timber and iron ore and fearsome warriors, beckoned as a prize worth conquering. Sweden, though never fully conquered or integrated into Cnut's realm, represented either a potential danger if it allied with Norway against Denmark, or a potential ally if its king could be brought into Cnut's orbit through marriage alliances and careful diplomacy. To rule such scattered territories effectively, Cnut needed representatives, regents, and trusted nobles who could act in his name and with his authority when he could not be physically present in person to make decisions and settle disputes. He could not be everywhere at once. If he was in England, then Denmark might be vulnerable to attack. If he was in Denmark, then Norway might rise in rebellion. If he was campaigning in Scandinavia, then English nobles might plot against him, or his young sons might be threatened. And so, in the year 1026, when Harthacnut was only about 8 years old, still very much a child despite his royal status, and despite the tremendous responsibilities that his birth had placed upon his small shoulders, a momentous decision was made that would fundamentally shape the entire rest of his life and determine his character and his fate. Cnut decided to send his young son across the North Sea to Denmark, sending him not as a mere visitor making a brief trip to see his father's other kingdom, but as the designated future king of that realm, the heir who would one day rule Denmark in his own right when his father eventually died. Denmark was facing increasing threats from both Norway to the north and Sweden to the east, and Cnut believed with sound strategic reasoning that placing his son there, under the guidance of trusted advisors and experienced warriors who could teach the boy the arts of kingship and war, would strengthen his hold on that crucial kingdom, while simultaneously preparing Harthacnut for the enormous responsibilities he would one day bear, training him to be a king who could rule effectively and command respect from hardened warriors and cunning nobles. The council appointed to guide and protect and educate young Harthacnut was headed by a powerful nobleman named Earl Ulf, also sometimes called Ulf Jarl in the Scandinavian sources. Ulf was married to Cnut's sister Estrid, making him Cnut's brother-in-law, connected to the royal family by the sacred bonds of marriage and kinship. Ulf was a man of considerable ability, proven in both warfare and administration, skilled at managing estates and leading warriors, respected by the Danish nobility for his prowess and his lineage. But he was also, as events would soon prove with terrible clarity, a man of considerable personal ambition, a man who looked at the power and wealth that surrounded the royal family and wanted more of it for himself, who saw opportunities in a child king far from his father and thought he could take advantage, how he would soon cause enormous problems and create a dangerous crisis that would end in his own violent destruction and death. But for now, at least in 1026, he seemed like a natural and obvious choice to serve as regent for the child king, to rule Denmark in Harthacnut's name until the boy grew old enough and experienced enough to rule in his own right. Imagine, if you can, if you will, the 8-year-old Harthacnut making that long and undoubtedly frightening journey from England across the often stormy waters of the North Sea to Denmark, leaving behind his mother and the familiar surroundings of Winchester and London, heading off to a land he had never seen, to live among people he did not know, to learn a role that must have seemed impossibly huge and heavy for such a small boy. For a child born in England, raised in English royal palaces, surrounded by English servants and English churchmen speaking English prayers, it must have seemed like traveling to another world entirely, even though his father ruled both lands, even though Danish and English were related languages that shared common Germanic roots. The crossing itself, even in good weather with favorable winds and calm seas, would have taken several days, perhaps 4 or 5 days if conditions were ideal, but possibly much longer if storms arose or winds turned contrary. the ships that would have carried young Harthacnut and his household. For even a child king travelled with dozens of servants and guards and advisors would have been a mixture of types. Perhaps some true Viking longships, sleek and swift, designed for war and raiding, with their distinctive dragon or serpent heads carved at the prow to frighten enemies and honour the old Norse traditions. But more likely, the bulk of the fleet would have consisted of broader, deeper merchant vessels called nars, designed to carry cargo and passengers more safely and comfortably across the open sea, trading speed for stability, better able to handle the heavy swells and unpredictable weather of the North Sea. The young prince would have watched the English coast recede behind him, would have spent days seeing nothing but grey water and grey sky in every direction, would have been sick from the ship's motion, for seasickness afflicts children especially harshly, would have been frightened by the storms that must have arisen. Ike would have prayed desperately when waves crashed over the sides of the ships, and sailors shouted and worked frantically to keep the vessels from being swamped and sinking beneath the cold water that would have killed everyone aboard within minutes from the shock of the freezing temperature. But eventually, after what must have seemed like an eternity to a frightened 8-year-old child, the shores of Denmark would have appeared on the horizon, low and marshy at first, then resolving into recognizable features, beaches and cliffs, harbours and settlements, and the young prince would have been welcomed, probably at one of the major Danish ports, perhaps at Roskilde on the island of Zealand, or at Hedeby in the south, welcomed with ceremony and celebration as the son of their king, as the future ruler of their land, as the boy who would one day sit on the throne that his grandfather and great-grandfather had occupied before his father. Denmark in the 1020s was a kingdom in the midst of profound transition and transformation. The old Norse paganism, with its gods of war and storm, Odin the All-Father, who hung on the world tree seeking wisdom, Thor the thunder god with his mighty hammer, Freya the goddess of love and fertility, was giving way, slowly, and not without considerable resistance and periodic backsliding, to Christianity, that religion of the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean world that had been slowly spreading northward for centuries. The great halls where warriors once feasted and drank and sang sagas of the old gods and the ancient heroes were being supplemented, and sometimes even replaced by churches and monasteries, buildings of stone rather than timber, filled with the smell of incense and the sound of Latin prayers, rather than the smell of roasting meat and the sound of boasting warriors. The Danish language that Harthacnut would have had to learn to speak fluently, not just understanding but mastering it completely if he was to rule effectively and command respect, was certainly cousin to the Old English he had known in his childhood, both languages descending ultimately from the same ancient Germanic tongue that had been spoken by the tribes who had migrated into northern Europe in the centuries after Rome's fall. But the languages were different enough, had evolved separately enough over the centuries, that each required serious study and constant practice to master fully. Harthacnut would have had tutors drilling him relentlessly in Danish vocabulary and grammar, would have been forced to speak Danish all day every day, until it became as natural to him as English had once been, until he could think and dream in Danish, rather than having to translate laboriously in his head. As Harthacnut grew from a small child into an adolescent boy in Denmark, spending year after year far from his mother and from the land of his birth, he would have been trained intensively in all the various arts and skills expected of a medieval prince of royal blood, all the things he would need to know to rule effectively and survive in a dangerous world. He would have learned to ride horses, progressing from gentle ponies, suited to a small boy, to increasingly larger and more spirited mounts as he grew. eventually mastering the great war horses that knights and nobles rode into battle, learning to control these powerful animals with knees and reins, learning to keep his seat even when the horse was running at full gallop over rough ground, or when shields and spears were crashing around him. He would have learned to handle weapons of all kinds, the sword, which was the mark of a true nobleman and warrior, expensive and difficult to forge well, requiring years of practice to use effectively. The spear, which was the common weapon of most warriors, cheaper and simpler than a sword, but deadly in skilled hands, useful both for stabbing at close quarters and for throwing at enemies before combat was joined. The axe, which was particularly favored by warriors of Scandinavian heritage, devastating against opponents wearing mail armor, capable of crushing through defenses that would turn a sword blade. The bow, less prestigious than blade weapons, but crucially important for hunting and for warfare both. For even though Harthacnut was destined by birth and position to rule, rather than to fight as a common warrior, a king who could not defend himself with weapons, who could not lead armies personally from the front as his father did, who could not inspire his warriors through displays of courage and martial prowess, would not be respected or obeyed. Medieval kingship required physical courage and military skill. A king had to be a war leader first and foremost, an administrator and judge only secondarily. A Harthacnut would have learned the complex and often confusing web of loyalties and relationships that bound the Danish nobility together in an intricate network of family ties, old feuds, alliances of convenience, and historical grievances stretching back generations. He would have learned which noble families could be trusted absolutely, whose word was their bond, and who would die rather than betray their king. He would have learned which families required careful watching, whose loyalty was conditional and temporary, who would support the king only as long as it served their interests and would turn against him the moment a better opportunity appeared. He would have learned which families hated each other with feuds so old that no one quite remembered how they started. Our families who would fight each other even if it meant weakening Denmark as a whole. He would have learned about the practical management of estates and properties, for kings needed to understand how wealth was generated and collected. He would have learned about agriculture, when to plant and when to harvest, what crops grew best in Denmark's climate, how much food needed to be stored away to survive the long winter months, when nothing grew and snow covered the ground. He would have learned about the collection of taxes and rents, which was the foundation of royal power. For without silver to pay warriors and sailors, without the ability to reward loyal followers, a king was nothing. And crucially, vitally important for a ruler of Denmark specifically, he would have learned about ships and the sea, and he would have learned about the maintenance of ships, how their timbers needed to be inspected constantly for rot and damage, how they needed to be pulled ashore periodically, and their hulls scraped clean of the barnacles and seaweed that accumulated and slowed them down, how sails needed to be mended and ropes replaced. Denmark's power rested fundamentally on its ability to move warriors quickly and efficiently across the seas, to strike at enemies before they could prepare defenses, to transport armies from one kingdom to another in days rather than the weeks or months that land travel would require. But even as young Harthacnut learned these essential lessons and slowly transformed from a child into a young man, even as he grew more confident in his role and more comfortable in his Danish surroundings, serious trouble was brewing that would soon explode into violence and crisis. Earl Ulf, Harthacnut's guardian and regent, the man who was supposed to be protecting the young prince and ruling wisely in his name until he came of age, began to overstep his authority in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to him and traumatic for Harthacnut, in a bold and extraordinarily foolish move that demonstrated either remarkable courage or stunning stupidity, depending on how one interprets his motives, Ulf persuaded the Danish nobles and the Assembly of Freemen to acknowledge Harthacnut as King of Denmark in his own right, without any reference to Cnut's overall authority as the supreme ruler who actually controlled all the lands. This was, in effect, a declaration that Harthacnut was an independent king, and that Denmark was no longer merely part of Knut's empire, but was its own separate kingdom. Whether Ulf hoped to control Denmark by controlling the young king, essentially making himself the real power behind a child king's throne, or whether he had some other motivation for this dangerous gambit, we cannot know for certain. The historical sources do not preserve his reasoning or his private thoughts, but the effect of his actions was crystal clear to everyone. Ulf was challenging Cnut's power directly, suggesting that Denmark might go its own way completely independent of the great North Sea Empire, that the Danish nobles might owe loyalty to young Harthacnut alone, rather than to his father. Adding insult to this already serious offence, compounding the problem and making everything worse, how Ulf failed to take vigorous and effective action against invasions and raids from Norway and Sweden that were probing Denmark's borders and testing its defences, instead of leading armies to meet these threats as a proper regent should, instead of defending Danish territory with force and determination. Ulf simply waited passively for Cnut to come from England and deal with the invasions himself. This was the exact opposite, the complete reverse, of what a regent's job was supposed to entail. The whole point of having a regent was so the king wouldn't have to be everywhere at once, so problems could be handled locally by trusted representatives. But Ulf was forcing Cnut to come to Denmark personally, essentially demonstrating that the regency system wasn't working, that Ulf either couldn't or wouldn't do his job properly. In 1027, and when Harthacnut was about 9 years old, and had been living in Denmark for roughly a year, his father arrived from England with a war fleet, dozens of ships carrying hundreds of hardened warriors, a display of overwhelming military force that made Knut's anger and determination absolutely clear to everyone who witnessed the fleet's arrival. The reunion between father and son must have been extraordinarily complex and emotionally difficult, filled with young Harthacnut's terrible fear and confusion, and the desperate desire to be loved and approved of by the father he barely knew anymore after their long separation. Knut, looking at his son, seeing a child who was still so small and vulnerable, not yet 10 years old, must have seen a boy who had been placed in an impossible position by an ambitious and treacherous regent, despite Ulf's attempts to manipulate the situation and claim that Harthacnut had been acting independently, that the young king had made these decisions himself. Cnut could see clearly that his son was far too young to be held responsible for the dangerous political machinations of adults. Harthacnut was just a child, being used as a pawn by Earl Ulf for Ulf's own ambitions, and so demonstrating a father's mercy toward his son, if not toward others. Cnut forgave young Harthacnut, recognizing that the boy was a victim of circumstances rather than a conspirator, absolving him of any responsibility for the crisis that had brought Knut racing across the sea with an army. But Earl Ulf received no such mercy or forgiveness. Shortly after Cnut's arrival in Denmark, while the royal court was gathered at Roskilde, the major city on the island of Zealand that served as one of Denmark's most important centres of royal power, Ulf was murdered, cut down by one of Cnut's housecarls, members of his personal bodyguard, elite professional warriors who had sworn oaths of absolute loyalty to the king, and who would carry out any command he gave them without question or hesitation, even if that command was to kill a nobleman, even if that nobleman was the king's own brother-in-law. The exact circumstances of Ulf's death vary somewhat depending on which medieval source one consults, for the chroniclers and saga writers of later generations embellished the story in different ways. Some sources state very directly and simply that Cnut ordered the killing as a deliberate execution, a punishment for Ulf's betrayal and incompetence, carried out in cold blood, as a lesson to any other nobles who might think they could challenge royal authority. Other accounts, more dramatic and perhaps more legendary than strictly factual, tell of a violent quarrel that erupted between Cnut and Ulf while they were playing chess, that ancient game of strategy that medieval nobles loved, with the two men arguing over moves on the board, their argument escalating from the game to larger matters of politics and loyalty, until finally, the next day, Christmas Day 1026, according to some sources, which would make the murder even more shocking since Christmas was a sacred holy day when violence was strictly forbidden by church law. One of Cnut's housecarls, perhaps acting on Nut's direct order, or perhaps simply sensing what the king wanted without being told explicitly, unkilled Ulf in Trinity Church in Roskilde, striking him down right there in a holy place, violating the sanctity of the church in order to eliminate a traitor. However the killing actually occurred, whether as cold-blooded execution or as murder following a quarrel, the message it sent was absolutely crystal clear to everyone in Denmark and beyond. Cnut was the supreme authority, the ultimate power, and those who challenged that authority, those who betrayed their trust, those who put their own ambitions ahead of loyalty to the king, would pay for their treachery with their lives. It didn't matter if you were the king's brother-in-law, didn't matter if you were married to the king's own sister, didn't matter if you were a powerful earl with your own warriors and lands. If you betrayed Nut, you would die. For young Harthacnut, witnessing Ulf's death or learning about it shortly afterward, the psychological impact must have been profound and traumatic. This was not simply abstract politics happening far away. Not just another story about kings and nobles doing violent things to each other in distant lands. This was immediate and personal. Ulf had been Harthacnut's guardian for over a year, someone the boy had seen every day, someone who had guided him and taught him and ruled in his name. Ulf had been family, connected by marriage to Harthacnut's Aunt Estrid, and yet Harthacnut's father had ordered, or at least permitted and approved, Ulf's killing, had him struck down without mercy or second thoughts. It was a brutal lesson in the harsh realities of medieval power politics, one that would fundamentally shape Harthacnut's understanding of what kingship meant and how rulers maintained their authority. He learned at 9 years old what many people never fully grasp even in long lifetimes, that power rests ultimately on violence or the threat of violence, that loyalty can evaporate in an instant when personal ambition beckons, that even family ties matter less than political necessity when a king's authority is challenged, that mercy and forgiveness have their limits, and that betrayal must be punished swiftly and dramatically, or else others will be emboldened to attempt their own betrayals. After dealing with Ulf in that violent and decisive fashion, making it absolutely clear who held ultimate power in Denmark, Cnut turned his military attention to the foreign threats that Ulf had so negligently allowed to develop. He led his warriors against the Norwegian and Swedish forces that had been probing at Denmark's borders, drove the invaders out of Danish territory through a combination of battle and intimidation, and established his authority over Norway as well, through a carefully orchestrated campaign that combined military force with political maneuvering and strategic bribes paid to Norwegian nobles, who were willing to abandon their king in exchange for Danish silver. By 1028, just 2 years after arriving in Denmark to deal with Ulf's betrayal, Cnut had achieved something truly remarkable. He was now king of 3 kingdoms simultaneously, England, Denmark and Norway. His North Sea empire had reached its greatest extent, encompassing more territory and more people than any northern European ruler had controlled since the fall of the Roman Empire. He ruled from the Arctic Circle in the far north, down to the English Channel in the south, from the Irish Sea in the west to the Baltic in the east. Ships carrying his commands and his tax collectors and his warriors could sail from any part of his empire to any other part in a matter of days or weeks. And then, Cnut returned to England in 1028, leaving Denmark under Harthacnut's nominal rule once again, though this time with the clear understanding, understood by Harthacnut himself and by every Danish noble and warrior, that the young prince ruled strictly as his father's representative, not as an independent king, that any major decisions would require Cnut's approval, and that any challenges to the system would be met with the same swift violence that had eliminated Earl Ulf. New regents were appointed, men who understood the limits of their authority, and who would not make Ulf's fatal mistake of trying to use the child king for their own ambitions. Meanwhile, Cnut's other son, Svein Knudsen, Harthacnut's older half-brother from Cnut's relationship with Elfgifu of Northampton, had been appointed to rule Norway as king with his mother Elfgifu, serving alongside him to provide guidance and wisdom. But Svein and Elfgifu, perhaps trying too hard to extract wealth from their new kingdom, perhaps not understanding Norwegian customs and sensibilities, perhaps simply unlucky in their timing, made themselves deeply and dangerously unpopular among the proud Norwegian people. They imposed heavy taxation to fund their government and their household, demanding silver from farmers and merchants and landowners who felt they were already paying enough. They favored Danish advisors over Norwegian nobles, giving the best positions and the most trust to men who had come with them from Denmark, rather than to the local Norwegian aristocracy, who felt they deserved those positions by right of birth and heritage. They tried to impose Danish customs and laws on a people who treasured their own Norwegian traditions. All of this created growing resentment and anger that simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to explode. That opportunity came in 1035 when Magnus, the son of the former Norwegian king Olaf, who had been driven out and killed in 1030, returned from exile with an army of supporters. And Magnus was young, probably in his early 20s, but he was Norwegian by birth. He represented the old Norwegian royal line, and he offered Norwegians a chance to throw off Danish rule and reclaim their independence. When Magnus invaded, the Norwegian people rose up enthusiastically to support him. Svein and Elfgifu, seeing that they were completely outnumbered and outmaneuvered, that they had lost the support of the Norwegian nobility and had no chance of holding the kingdom against Magnus and his supporters, were forced to flee in humiliation, abandoning Norway and seeking refuge at Harthacnut's court in Denmark, coming as refugees to the half-brother and stepson, who had to take them in despite the embarrassing circumstances of their arrival. Harthacnut welcomed his half-brother Svein with genuine warmth and offered him safe sanctuary, for they were brothers after all, both sons of Cnut, both princes who understood the burdens and dangers of their position. Harthacnut gave Svein shelter and support, shared his resources with him, treated him with honor despite his failure in Norway. But Harthacnut also recognized, with clear-eyed political realism, that he did not have sufficient military resources or political support to launch an invasion to reclaim Norway for his brother, to attempt to reverse Magnus's conquest and restore Danish rule. Norway was lost to the family, probably permanently, and Harthacnut was wise enough to accept this reality, rather than wasting his limited resources on a hopeless campaign that would likely end in disaster. And this pragmatic decision not to fight for Norway would have important consequences later, for it led Harthacnut to make a treaty with Magnus that would affect the succession in both their kingdoms. But we're getting ahead of our story. For now, in the early 1030s, Harthacnut was still living in Denmark, still serving as his father's representative, still learning the arts of kingship, still waiting for the day when he would inherit his father's crowns and rule in his own right, rather than in someone else's name. And then, in November of 1035, when Harthacnut was only about 17 years old, barely on the cusp of manhood, still not fully mature or experienced, devastating news arrived from England that would change everything and throw the entire North Sea Empire into chaos and crisis. King Cnut the Great, a ruler of England and Denmark, and nominal overlord of parts of Norway and Sweden, master of the North Sea Empire that he had built through decades of warfare and diplomacy, had died suddenly at Shaftesbury in southern England. He was only about 40 years old, far too young by any measure, cut down in what should have been the absolute prime of his life, the height of his power and abilities, possibly by some sudden illness or injury, whose exact nature was never recorded with precision in any surviving source. Medieval medicine was primitive, and even kings could be carried off by infections or internal problems that modern doctors could easily cure with antibiotics or surgery. But in 1035, even a king's wealth and power couldn't save him when sickness struck. Cnut's death changed absolutely everything in an instant, and the great empire he had built through 20 years of conquest and careful management was thrown immediately into uncertainty and potential chaos. 3 kingdoms, England, Denmark, and Norway, had been united under one extraordinarily strong ruler, whose military prowess and political skill had been sufficient to hold everything together. But now that ruler was gone, dead and buried, and his sons would have to fight for their inheritance, would have to prove themselves worthy to inherit what their father had built, would have to convince nobles and warriors to follow them, rather than seeking independence or supporting rival claimants. Under the terms that Cnut had agreed with Emma of Normandy before their marriage, terms that had been witnessed by churchmen and nobles and written down in documents, Harthacnut was the legitimate heir to both England and Denmark. He was the son of Cnut's legally recognized wife Emma, born in lawful Christian marriage that had been blessed by the church, designated explicitly as his father's primary heir. The agreement Cnut had made was clear. Sons from his marriage to Emma would take precedence over any sons from earlier relationships. This meant that Harthacnut, and Harthacnut alone, was supposed to inherit his father's kingdoms. Harthacnut quickly and smoothly succeeded his father as King of Denmark, taking the royal title as Cnut III, the third King Cnut in Danish history. The Danish nobles, who had known Harthacnut for nearly a decade, who had watched him grow from a child into a young man, who had seen him learning to rule under his father's guidance, accepted him without serious opposition or controversy. There was no crisis in Denmark, no question about the succession, no competition from rival claimants. Harthacnut was their king, and they acknowledged him as such immediately. But England presented a far more difficult and dangerous problem, one that would consume years of Harthacnut's life and cause enormous suffering to many people. Harthacnut was in Denmark, hundreds of miles away from England, across the often stormy and always dangerous waters of the North Sea, separated from his English inheritance by days of difficult sailing even in good weather, by weeks or even months if winter storms closed the sea routes entirely. And he could not simply abandon Denmark to travel to England and claim his English throne, and could not jump on a ship and sail away, without regard for the consequences. The reason was Magnus of Norway, that young Norwegian king who had so recently driven out Svein and Elfgifu and reclaimed Norwegian independence from Danish rule, was still a very real and very serious threat to Denmark's security. Magnus had ships and warriors. He had momentum and confidence from his recent victory. And if Harthacnut left Denmark undefended to claim England, Magnus might well invade Denmark while Harthacnut was away, might conquer Danish territory, might even try to make himself king of Denmark as well as Norway, reversing all of Cnut's conquests and destroying the North Sea Empire completely. It was a genuine dilemma with no easy solution. Stay in Denmark and risk losing England, or go to England and risk losing Denmark. Harthacnut, showing the caution that would characterize his entire career, chose to stay in Denmark and defend what he definitely held, rather than risking everything to claim what he might not be able to keep. In England itself, faced with the news of Cnut's death and Harthacnut's absence, the kingdom's leading nobles had to make difficult decisions about who would rule. They couldn't simply wait indefinitely for Harthacnut to appear. England needed a government, needed someone to settle disputes and maintain order, needed a king, or at least a regent, to exercise royal authority. Without clear leadership, the kingdom might descend into civil war between competing factions, or foreign enemies might invade, or simple lawlessness might spread as criminals realized there was no strong authority to punish them. And a compromise was initially reached that might have worked if circumstances had been different. Harthacnut's half-brother, Harold Harefoot, the son of Cnut and Ælfgifu of Northampton, the man whose legitimacy was questionable but who was at least present in England rather than absent in Denmark, would serve as regent, ruling England in Harthacnut's name until Harthacnut could safely make the journey across the North Sea and claim his throne in person. Meanwhile, Harthacnut's mother, Queen Emma, that formidable woman who had already survived so much political upheaval and who was determined to secure her son's inheritance, would hold the wealthy and important kingdom of Wessex in the south of England on her son's behalf, supported by Earl Godwin of Wessex, one of the most powerful and influential nobles in all of England, a man who controlled vast estates and could command thousands of warriors. This arrangement, Harold as regent in the north, Emma holding Wessex in the south, everyone officially waiting for Harthacnut to arrive and take his rightful place, might have worked and held together if it had been a temporary situation lasting only a few months. But as months turned into a year, and then into 2 years, and still Harthacnut remained stuck in Denmark, dealing with the Norwegian threat, the arrangement began to look increasingly unstable and unsustainable. Harold Harefoot had ambitions of his own, ambitions that grew stronger the longer he exercised royal power, and the more he got used to being treated as a king. He was, after all, also Cnut's son, even if not born of the marriage to Emma, even if his mother Ælfgifu's exact status as wife or mistress remained somewhat unclear. He had supporters among the English nobility, particularly in the north, where many people were of Danish or Norwegian descent, and had no particular love for the southern English or their Norman-born queen. These northern nobles saw Harold as one of them, as someone who understood their concerns and their culture, whereas Harthacnut was an unknown figure far away in Denmark, someone they had never seen, who might not even speak English properly anymore after so many years in Scandinavia. Harold was supported strongly and consistently by Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, a powerful nobleman who controlled the middle regions of England and who commanded significant military forces. Leofric was married to a woman named Godgifu, and though history would remember her by the anglicised version of her name, Lady Godiva, the woman who would later become famous, though probably largely through legend rather than fact, for supposedly riding naked through the streets of Coventry to protest against oppressive taxation. The people of London, that increasingly important commercial centre, where merchants and craftsmen were growing wealthy through trade, also backed Harold, seeing him as a practical choice who was actually present and could make decisions, rather than an absent king they might never see. The Thanes of Northumbria in the far north, those lesser nobles who weren't powerful enough to be called earls, but who collectively controlled significant resources and warriors, also generally supported Harold, or at least didn't actively oppose him. They were practical men who needed someone to settle their disputes and confirm their landholdings, and Harold was there, while Harthacnut was not. As the months passed and turned into years, and still Harthacnut remained in Denmark, dealing with Magnus, and unable to come to England, Harold's position grew stronger and stronger. The arrangement that had been made initially, Harold as mere regent, Emma holding Wessex, everyone waiting for Harthacnut, began to look increasingly like a fiction that no one really believed in anymore. Harold was exercising royal power, making decisions, settling disputes, commanding armies, issuing coins with his own name on them. For all practical purposes, he was already acting as king, even if he didn't yet have the formal title or the recognition of all the English nobles and churchmen. And then tragedy struck Emma's household in a way that would poison relations between the families forever and create a blood debt that would never be fully repaid. In 1036, roughly a year after Nut's death, Emma's son Alfred, Harthacnut's half-brother through their shared mother Emma, born from Emma's first marriage to Ethelred the Unready, attempted to come to England from Normandy, where he and his brother Edward had been living in exile ever since Cnut had conquered England back in 1016, 20 years earlier. Why Alfred came to England, what his exact purpose was, remains somewhat murky and disputed by historians even today. Some sources suggest he was responding to a letter from his mother Emma, who was supposedly inviting him to visit her in Winchester, where she maintained her household. Others hint that Alfred may have been attempting to make his own bid for power during the confusion following Cnut's death, that he thought he might be able to claim the English throne for himself based on his descent from Ethelred and the old Anglo-Saxon royal line. Norman sources, which naturally tend to be more sympathetic to Alfred, claim that his older brother Edward had already made an attempt to return to England earlier in 1036, sailing up the Solent near Southampton and winning a small battle or skirmish against local forces before deciding the situation was too dangerous and returning to Normandy with whatever plunder his warriors had managed to seize. Whatever Alfred's true motivations, whether he was simply visiting his mother, or whether he was making a play for the throne, or something in between, his journey to England ended in absolute horror and tragedy that shocked even contemporaries who were quite accustomed to political violence. Alfred landed on the coast of Sussex with a significant military force, a guard of Norman soldiers and warriors, probably several hundred strong, that he had brought with him from Normandy to protect him during his journey and to demonstrate his importance and status as a prince of royal blood. These Norman warriors were well-equipped professional fighters, experienced in warfare, loyal to their prince, ready to defend him with their lives if necessary. Alfred and his Norman guard began to make their way inland from the Sussex coast, heading northwest toward Winchester, where his mother Emma waited, travelling through the late winter or early spring English countryside. But near Guildford in Surrey, roughly 30 miles southwest of London, as they approached the Thames Valley, they were met by Earl Godwin of Wessex, that same powerful nobleman who supposedly supported Emma and Harthacnut's cause, who was supposed to be defending Emma's interests and preparing for Harthacnut's eventual arrival. What happened next at Guildford is one of the darkest, most controversial, and most disputed episodes of this entire period, and the various medieval sources give us conflicting accounts that cannot all be true simultaneously. Some chronicles say that Godwin welcomed Alfred warmly, swore public oaths of loyalty and fealty to him, provided lodging for Alfred and his Norman warriors at Guildford for the night, procured food and drink for them, treated them as honoured guests, and then, in the darkest hours before dawn, betrayed them completely. According to this version, Harold Harefoot's forces attacked suddenly during the night, taking advantage of Godwin's treachery, seizing Alfred and his men while they slept or were unprepared, overwhelming them through surprise and superior numbers. Other sources suggest a somewhat different sequence of events, claiming that Godwin was overwhelmed by Harold's superior military power, that he had no real choice in what happened, that he was essentially forced to hand Alfred over to Harold's agents to save his own life and position. According to this interpretation, Godwin didn't actively plan the betrayal, but was compelled by circumstances to go along with it, making him perhaps morally compromised but not actively evil, a victim of political reality rather than a willing conspirator in murder. Still, other accounts blend elements of both stories or add additional complications, suggesting that the truth was probably more complex than any single chronicle can capture, that there were probably negotiations and threats and counter-threats happening behind the scenes that no source fully recorded, that Godwin's exact role fell somewhere between active conspirator and helpless witness. But regardless of exactly how the betrayal unfolded, regardless of Godwin's precise level of responsibility and guilt, what we know for absolutely certain is the terrible result, the horrifying outcome that all sources agree upon in their broad outlines, even if they differ in specific details. Alfred was seized, captured by Harold's forces, or handed over by Godwin, or some combination thereof, and then began a nightmare of calculated cruelty that was shocking even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. Alfred's Norman guards, those hundreds of strong warriors who had accompanied him from Normandy to protect their prince, who had sworn oaths to defend him with their lives, were systematically slaughtered. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that invaluable year-by-year record of English history kept by monks in various monasteries, preserves a chilling description of what happened to these men. According to the Chronicle, 9/10 of them were murdered outright, killed in cold blood after they had surrendered or been captured, executed without trial or mercy. 9 out of every 10 Norman warriors were simply killed, and the remaining 10th, those warriors who were lucky enough or important enough to be spared immediate execution. According to the Chronicle, they were still so numerous after the others had been killed that they too were decimated, a grim reference to the ancient Roman practice of executing every 10th man in a unit as punishment for cowardice or mutiny. So even among those who survived the initial slaughter, 1 in 10 was executed, reducing Alfred's guard even further. But even this wasn't the end of the horror, for the Chronicle continues with more gruesome details about what happened to the survivors. The remaining men, however many were left after 9/10 were killed, and 1/10 of the remainder were decimated, were scattered and dispersed to various fates. Some were blinded, having their eyes burned out or gouged out, a punishment that was often used against royal claimants in medieval times because a blind man was considered unfit to rule. Some had their hands chopped off, permanently maiming them and ensuring they could never fight again. Some were scalped, a brutal and painful mutilation that might or might not be fatal depending on how deeply the scalp was removed and whether infections set in afterward. Some were sold into slavery, shipped away to foreign lands to spend the rest of their lives in bondage. In a mass grave discovered by archaeologists to the west of Guildford in the 1920s, excavators found the remains of several hundred men who had been bound and executed, buried together in a hasty mass grave that was probably dug shortly after the killings. The bodies have been dated through various methods to approximately 1036 to 1040, and making it highly likely, though not absolutely certain, that these are the remains of Alfred's Norman Guard, the warriors who died trying to protect their prince, buried together in an unmarked grave far from their Norman homeland, their bones resting in English soil for nearly 1,000 years before being discovered by chance. As for Alfred himself, the prince who had come to England to visit his mother or to claim his inheritance or both, his fate was even more terrible than that of his warriors. He was bound with ropes or chains, tied up securely so he couldn't resist or escape, and then taken by boat to the Isle of Ely in Cambridgeshire, far to the northeast of Guildford, where a great and ancient monastery stood on an island rising from the surrounding fenland marshes. Ely was remote and defensible, and surrounded by water and treacherous marshes that made it nearly impossible to approach without local knowledge, making it a perfect prison for a captured prince, according to the detailed description preserved in the Chronicle of John of Worcester and other sources, as the boat carrying Alfred approached the island of Ely. As the monastery came into view across the water, the prince was deliberately and brutally blinded, having his eyes put out, probably burned out with hot irons, which was the usual method for such mutilations, though some sources suggest they may have been gouged out with knives or daggers. This blinding was not just torture for its own sake, though it was certainly that. It was a symbolic act, a deliberate statement that Alfred would never be king, could never be king, because a blind man was considered fundamentally unfit to rule in medieval thinking. Kingship required the ability to see one's enemies and one's subjects, to witness oaths being sworn, to read documents, to lead armies. A blind king was a contradiction in terms, an impossibility. The half-blind, grievously wounded prince was then carried ashore to the monastery at Ely, where the monks, holy men who had dedicated their lives to God, prayer, and acts of mercy, took him in and cared for him as best they could, with the limited medical knowledge available to them in that era. They probably washed his wounds, applied whatever salves and ointments they knew, prayed over him, perhaps administered the last rites if they thought death was approaching. They were fond of him, according to one source, moved by compassion for his suffering and by horror at what had been done to this young prince. But their care, however devoted and sincere, could not save Alfred. The wounds were too severe, the damage too great, infection probably setting in despite the monk's best efforts. Medieval medicine had no concept of germs or bacteria, no antibiotics to fight infection, no way to prevent the sepsis that almost certainly developed from such terrible wounds. Alfred died in agony, probably on February 5th, 1036, though the exact date is recorded somewhat differently in various sources. He was buried at Ely Cathedral, laid to rest in the church where he had died, far from the royal tombs at Winchester, where his father Ethelred rested, far from his mother Emma, who had not been able to protect him. For Emma, waiting in Winchester, and the news of Alfred's death must have been utterly devastating, a grief almost too great to bear. She had already lost her first husband Ethelred to death, and her throne to Cnut's conquest. She had been forced to send her sons Edward and Alfred into exile in Normandy, not seeing them for 20 years while they grew from boys to men in a foreign land. And now, when one of them had tried to return to her, had tried to cross the channel to see his mother, or to help defend her interests, or to claim his heritage, he had been captured, tortured, blinded, and left to die slowly from his wounds. And Emma was powerless to stop it, powerless to save him, powerless to avenge him, trapped in Winchester, while Harold Harefoot's power grew stronger, and his own position became more and more precarious. The question of who bore ultimate moral and legal responsibility for Alfred's murder would haunt and poison English politics for years, creating feuds and resentments that would shape events long after everyone directly involved was dead. Harold Harefoot had clearly ordered Alfred's capture and punishment, or at least approved it after the fact. Alfred was a potential rival for the throne, another possible claimant to Cnut's inheritance, and eliminating him served Harold's interest perfectly by removing a dangerous competitor. Harold's guilt was obvious and undeniable. But what of Earl Godwin? This question was more complicated and more disputed. Had Godwin actively betrayed Alfred, welcoming him with false promises, and then deliberately handing him over to Harold's forces in exchange for reward or protection? Or had Godwin been overwhelmed by superior force, compelled to surrender Alfred against his will to save his own life and his family? Godwin would later claim, under oath in formal legal proceedings, that he acted under Harold's direct orders, that he had no choice in what happened, that he was essentially following the commands of the man who was exercising royal power in England at that time. But Emma and her son Harthacnut would never fully forgive or trust Godwin again, and the stain on his reputation would never quite wash away, following him to his grave and affecting his son's relationships with later English kings. By the year 1037, roughly 2 years after Cnut's death, and more than a year after Alfred's horrific murder, the political situation in England had reached a critical breaking point that could no longer be sustained or ignored. The compromise arrangement that had been put in place after Cnut's death, Harold as regent in the north, Emma holding Wessex in the south, everyone supposedly waiting for Harthacnut to arrive from Denmark, was clearly failing and becoming untenable. Harthacnut remained stuck in Denmark, still unable to leave because Magnus of Norway continued to pose a very real threat to Danish security, still trapped hundreds of miles away from the English throne that was rightfully his by birth and by his father's clear designation. Harold Harefoot, no longer content to be merely regent, no longer willing to pretend that he was simply keeping the throne warm for his half-brother Harthacnut, and now openly and publicly claimed the throne of England for himself. He declared that he was not regent but king, not a temporary placeholder, but the rightful ruler of England in his own right. Despite the strong objections and formal protests of Ethelnoth, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the highest-ranking churchman in all of England, the man who had crowned Cnut the Great back in 1016, and who knew perfectly well what Cnut's wishes regarding the succession had been, who understood that Cnut had explicitly designated Harthacnut as his heir. Harold was formally proclaimed King of England and crowned in a ceremony at Oxford. The coronation at Oxford, rather than at the traditional coronation site of Winchester or London, was itself significant and telling. Winchester was Emma's stronghold, the city where she maintained her household and treasury, in the place where she still commanded loyalty and could potentially disrupt a coronation ceremony. London, though generally supportive of Harold, was still a major city where opposition might organise and cause problems. Oxford, in the heart of Mercia, where Earl Leofric's support for Harold was strongest, was safer and more secure for a contested coronation. The ceremony probably wasn't conducted by Archbishop Ethelnoth, who refused to recognise Harold's kingship, but by some other bishop who was either genuinely convinced of Harold's legitimacy or who was willing to go along with the political reality of the situation, regardless of his personal beliefs about the legal niceties of succession. With Harold now claiming the title of king rather than regent, and with his position growing stronger every day as nobles and warriors who had been sitting on the fence decided to support the man who actually held power rather than the absent prince across the sea, Emma's position in Wessex became increasingly dangerous and ultimately impossible. She was, after all, holding territory that Harold now claimed as his own, commanding the loyalty of warriors and nobles, in direct defiance of the man who now called himself king. It was an intolerable situation from Harold's perspective, and he had both the desire and the power to do something about it. In 1037, probably in the latter part of the year, Emma of Normandy, twice Queen of England, mother of princes and kings, one of the most powerful and wealthy women in all of Europe, was forced to flee from England for her life. She abandoned her estates in Wessex, left behind much of the vast treasure she had accumulated over decades as queen, packed what portable wealth she could carry, gold and silver and jewels that could be converted to coin or used to buy support, and took ship across the Channel to Bruges in Flanders, now in modern Belgium, but then a prosperous commercial city, and the seat of the Count of Flanders, who was willing to grant her sanctuary and protection. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this momentous event with simple but telling language. Harold was everywhere chosen as king. The implication is clear. Emma's cause had collapsed, her support had evaporated, and the nobles who had been willing to hold Wessex for Harthacnut while he was expected to arrive soon were no longer willing to defy Harold's authority now that he had been king for months and showed no signs of being dislodged. Whatever chance Harthacnut might have had to claim England peacefully was gone now. If he wanted his inheritance, he would have to fight for it, would have to invade with an army and take the throne by force from his half-brother who now held it. The details of Emma's flight and exactly how it came about remain somewhat obscure, lost to history because the sources don't provide a detailed narrative. Did Emma flee before Harold's armies actually attacked Wessex, choosing discretion and survival over a hopeless last stand? Or was she driven out by military force, her strongholds besieged and captured, yet her supporters defeated in battle or frightened into submission? We don't know for certain. The account in various versions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle jumps abruptly from Harold being regent to Harold being universally accepted as king, without explaining the intermediate steps or describing Emma's departure in detail. What we know is simply the result. Emma was gone, driven into exile, and Harold was everywhere chosen as king. In Bruges, reunited with her son Harthacnut, who would eventually sail there to meet her, Emma was not idle or passive despite her reduced circumstances. She had lost England for the moment, had lost her position and much of her wealth, but she had not lost her determination or her political cunning. She immediately began plotting and planning for the day when her son Harthacnut could reclaim what was rightfully his, working every angle she could think of to keep Harthacnut's claim alive and to undermine Harold's legitimacy in the eyes of both the English nobility and the wider European community. Emma sponsored and paid for the writing of a remarkable work known to history as the Encomium Emmae Reginae, which translates from the Latin as In Praise of Queen Emma, or an encomium for Queen Emma. An encomium was a form of praise literature, a work designed to celebrate and glorify its subject. And this particular encomium was exactly that, a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to present Emma's version of events and to emphasize Harthacnut's legitimate claim to the English throne, while attacking Harold Harefoot's character and legitimacy. The work was written by an anonymous monk, someone skilled in Latin composition and familiar with the conventions of medieval historical writing and hagiography, but whose name has not survived in any source. Internal evidence from the text itself suggests it was composed around 1041 or 1042, during Emma's exile in Bruges, and was probably intended to be presented to Harthacnut or to circulate among European nobles and churchmen to build support for Harthacnut's cause. The encomium praised Harthacnut lavishly, presenting him as the rightful heir, aren't the legitimate son of a legitimate marriage, the designated successor to his father's great empire. It attacked Harold Harefoot implicitly and sometimes explicitly, emphasizing particularly his role in the murder of Alfred and suggesting that Harold was a usurper with no real right to the throne he had seized. The encomium was a weapon in what we might call an information war or propaganda campaign, an attempt to shape how people thought about the succession crisis, to keep alive the idea that Harthacnut was the true king and that Harold was merely a temporary usurper who would eventually be brought down. Whether it actually changed anyone's mind or influenced events in any concrete way is impossible to say. We don't know how widely it circulated or who read it, but it represents Emma's determination to fight back by any means available, using words and ideas as weapons even when she lacked armies and military power. Meanwhile, back in Denmark, Harthacnut was dealing with his own set of serious problems that had nothing to do with England, but that prevented him from doing anything about England, even as his inheritance was being stolen from him. Magnus of Norway remained a constant threat on Denmark's borders, a danger that could not be ignored or wished away. Magnus was young, probably in his early 20s like Harthacnut himself, but he had proven his military abilities by conquering Norway and driving out Svein and Elfgifu. He had warriors and ships at his command. He had the momentum and confidence that comes from recent victory, and he had potential designs on Denmark itself. And the situation between these two young kings, Harthacnut and Magnus, was dangerous and unstable, a powder keg that could explode into full-scale war at any moment. Neither king had the clear military superiority that would allow him to simply crush the other. They were roughly evenly matched in terms of resources and military power, which meant that a war between them would likely be long, expensive, destructive, and uncertain in outcome. Both kingdoms would suffer terribly from prolonged warfare, with villages burned, crops destroyed, young men killed in battle, wealth expended on weapons and ships that could have been used for productive purposes, and so, showing pragmatic wisdom that was sometimes lacking in medieval kings, who often preferred glorious warfare to sensible compromise, Harthacnut and Magnus eventually came to an agreement that resolved their immediate conflict in a creative way. In either 1038 or 1039, the sources vary slightly on the exact date, they made a formal treaty, witnessed by nobles and churchmen from both kingdoms, sealed with oaths sworn on holy relics in the presence of God, binding them to a specific arrangement that would shape the future of both their kingdoms. The treaty stated, in essence, that if either of them died without leaving a legitimate heir, without a son to inherit the kingdom, then the survivor would automatically inherit the dead king's realm. It was a mutual insurance policy, a pragmatic recognition that both their positions were somewhat precarious and uncertain. Harthacnut had no wife and no children, though he was still young enough that marriage and fatherhood seemed likely in the future. Magnus was similarly unmarried and childless. If either died unexpectedly before producing an heir, this treaty ensured that his kingdom wouldn't fall into chaos and civil war with multiple claimants fighting over the succession. Instead, it would pass smoothly to the other king, consolidating power rather than fragmenting it. The treaty had enormous and far-reaching implications that would play out over the coming years. It meant that Magnus had a potential legal claim to Denmark if Harthacnut died childless, which would happen just a few years later as events unfolded. It also gave Harthacnut, at least in theory and on paper, a potential claim to Norway if Magnus died without children, and though this possibility never materialized because Magnus would outlive Harthacnut and would eventually have heirs of his own. But most importantly for Harthacnut's immediate needs and concerns, the treaty secured his northern border with Norway and freed him to turn his attention southward toward England, to begin thinking seriously about how he might reclaim his English inheritance from Harold. With peace secured in Scandinavia, or at least with open warfare between Denmark and Norway averted through their treaty arrangement, Harthacnut in 1039 sailed from Denmark with a fleet of 10 ships to meet his mother Emma in Bruges, where she had been living in exile since being driven from England 2 years earlier. Mother and son, reunited after years of separation during which Emma had been in England, while Harthacnut was in Denmark, and now had the opportunity to plan together, to discuss strategy, to decide how they would reclaim what had been stolen from them. Harthacnut brought with him those 10 ships carrying Danish warriors, professional fighters who were loyal to him personally and who were ready to fight for their king's cause. Emma brought with her what remained of her considerable wealth and her extensive network of political connections throughout Europe. Together, they began to plan a serious military invasion of England. Harthacnut would bring his Danish warriors across the Channel in force, landing somewhere on the English coast, probably in the south or southeast, where the crossing was shortest, and where Emma might still have some supporters among the local population. They would fight their way inland if necessary, rallying whatever English nobles might be willing to abandon Harold and support Harthacnut's legitimate claim, besieging Harold's strongholds, forcing him either to surrender the throne or to fight a decisive battle that would determine England's future. Ships were gathered and provisioned. Weapons were prepared and sharpened. Warriors were recruited and trained. Supplies were purchased and loaded aboard the vessels. Emma probably spent considerable amounts of her remaining wealth paying for all of this, buying the food and equipment that an invasion force would need. Plans were made for where to land, who to contact once they arrived in England, how to maximize their initial impact and gain momentum quickly before Harold could organize an effective defense. Harthacnut's invasion fleet began to take shape through the summer and fall of 1039, growing larger as more ships arrived, as more warriors signed on for the campaign, as more resources were committed to the enterprise. But as Harthacnut's ships lay at anchor in Bruges harbour, and his warriors camped nearby, waiting for the order to embark and sail for England, as final preparations were made and last-minute intelligence was gathered about conditions in England and Harold's military dispositions, news arrived from across the Channel that changed absolutely everything and made the entire invasion plan suddenly unnecessary. Harold Harefoot, King of England, the man who had stolen Harthacnut's throne and who had murdered Alfred and driven Emma into exile, was dying. Harold's death on March 17th, 1040, at Oxford, the same city where he had been crowned king just a few years earlier, came suddenly and mysteriously, completely without warning. He was only about 24 years old, barely into adulthood, younger even than Harthacnut, at an age when young men are typically in excellent physical health and at the peak of their strength and vigor. Medieval sources provide almost no details about what killed him or what symptoms he experienced before his death, which is frustrating for historians trying to understand what happened. No chronicler describes a long illness or progressive deterioration. The sources simply report that he died, suddenly and unexpectedly, leaving his throne vacant and throwing England into uncertainty once again. Some contemporaries, and naturally suspicious and prone to seeing conspiracy and poison in any unexpected death of a powerful person, whispered that Harold might have been poisoned by enemies who wanted him removed from power. Poison was certainly used as a weapon of assassination in the medieval period, and Harold had made plenty of enemies who would have been delighted to see him dead, Emma and Harthacnut, most obviously, but also any remaining supporters of Alfred, or English nobles who preferred the old Anglo-Saxon line, or people who simply resented Harold's rule for various personal or political reasons. But no medieval source provides any real evidence of poisoning. No testimony from servants or doctors or witnesses suggesting that Harold's death looked like poison, rather than natural causes. Other sources speak vaguely of Harold being struck down by elf shot, a medieval Anglo-Saxon term for sudden, inexplicable illness that seemed to strike from nowhere like an invisible arrow shot by supernatural beings. This wasn't meant literally. Educated people didn't actually believe that elves were shooting magical arrows at kings, but rather it was a metaphorical way of describing sudden illness or stroke or heart attack or any other medical crisis that seemed to have no obvious external cause. Modern doctors, looking at the limited description we have of Harold's death, have speculated about various possibilities that might explain a sudden death in a young adult male. Infection leading to septic shock, acute appendicitis causing peritonitis, aneurysm bursting in the brain or aorta, a heart attack from some congenital defect or from extreme stress, various other conditions that could kill quickly and without much warning. Whatever the precise medical cause, and we'll almost certainly never know for sure given the limited evidence available, the result was the same, and the effect on the political situation was dramatic. Harold was dead, his body laid out in Oxford, his short reign of just a few years suddenly over. He was buried initially at Westminster Abbey, that great church that Edward the Confessor would later rebuild magnificently, but which was already an important royal monastery in Harold's time, laid to rest with the ceremonies appropriate for a king, even though many people still considered him a usurper who had stolen a throne that wasn't rightfully his. Harold's death removed the main obstacle to Harthacnut's succession to the English throne. There would be no need now for the invasion that had been planned so carefully. No need for the battles and sieges and political maneuvering that everyone had expected. No need for Danish warriors to land on English beaches and fight their way inland against Harold's forces. Instead, English nobles immediately and without significant hesitation sent envoys racing across the Channel to Bruges, sailing across the grey waters of the North Sea to where Harthacnut waited with his fleet and his mother, offering him the throne of England, inviting him to come and take his rightful inheritance, promising him their loyalty and support if he would just cross the Channel and be crowned king. On June 17th, 1040, just 3 months after Harold's death, and roughly 7 days before Midsummer's Day on the calendar, Harthacnut's fleet appeared off the coast of Sandwich in Kent, one of the major ports on the southeastern coast of England, where the Channel crossing was shortest and where there were good harbours for landing ships and unloading men and supplies. But though Harthacnut came as the invited king, though the English nobles had sent to him and asked him to come, though there was no one openly opposing his claim or threatening to fight against him, he nevertheless came fully prepared as a conqueror who expected potential opposition and was ready to crush it violently if necessary. His fleet that day, as it appeared on the horizon with sails billowing and oars flashing in the sunlight, numbered an impressive and intimidating 62 warships, a massive show of military force that made it absolutely clear that Harthacnut would not be at the mercy of the English nobles or dependent on their goodwill and continued support. These were not merchant vessels that could be easily overwhelmed or intimidated. These were warships, Danish longships, and their larger cousins, vessels specifically designed for warfare and the transport of fighting men, crewed by experienced sailors who could navigate in any conditions and filled with hundreds of Danish warriors who were professional fighters, men who made their living through war. who had trained with weapons since childhood, who had followed Harthacnut in Denmark, and who expected to be richly rewarded for their loyalty and service. These 62 ships represented an enormous commitment of Denmark's military resources, are probably a significant portion of the entire Danish navy, and their presence sent a clear message to anyone in England who might be thinking about opposing the new king or trying to manipulate him or limit his power. Harthacnut had the military strength to enforce his will, had warriors who would fight for him, had the ability to destroy anyone who challenged his authority. He was coming not as a suppliant hoping for English acceptance, but as a king claiming what was rightfully his, and ready to fight for it if anyone dared to stand in his way. And those hundreds of Danish warriors aboard the 62 warships fully expected to be rewarded for their service and their loyalty. They hadn't sailed from Denmark to England out of pure devotion to their king or abstract ideals about legitimate succession. They were professionals who expected payment, who had families to support, who needed silver and land and positions of authority as compensation for their time and their willingness to fight and possibly die for their king. Medieval warriors followed kings primarily for material rewards, for loot, for land grants, for positions in the king's household, for the opportunity to advance themselves and their families. A king who couldn't or wouldn't reward his followers would quickly find himself without followers, and rewarded they would be, though the method of that reward would make Harthacnut deeply and lastingly unpopular with his English subjects from the very beginning of his reign, poisoning his relationship with the people he was supposed to rule, creating resentment that would never entirely disappear during his brief time on the throne. To pay the crews of his 62 warships for their service in bringing him to England and for their continued loyalty, Harthacnut levied a geld, a tax collected in silver, of more than £21,000 on England as a whole. Some sources put the figure even higher, at £23,000 or even £24,000, depending on which chronicle one consults and how they calculated the total. To understand just how enormous and crushing this sum was, how much it would have impacted ordinary people's lives, we must try to comprehend the economic realities of medieval England, which was not a wealthy society by any modern standard. The vast majority of the population, probably 90% or more, were farmers who lived close to subsistence level, growing grain and vegetables and raising animals primarily to feed their own families, with only a small surplus available to pay rents to their lords and taxes to the king. The coinage system was based on silver pennies, small coins that represented significant value, with 12 pennies making 1 shilling and 20 shillings making £1. Even a handful of silver pennies represented real wealth to an ordinary farmer or craftsman, enough to buy tools or cloth or food during a shortage. £21,000 of silver, then, was an almost unimaginable sum to most people, equivalent to millions of individual silver pennies that had to be collected from villages and towns all across England through a complex administrative system. Every hide of land, the unit by which taxation was calculated, representing roughly the amount of land needed to support one family, was assessed for a certain number of pennies or shillings. Local officials called reeves had to go farm to farm, village to village, collecting the silver, often having to accept payment in goods or livestock that then had to be sold to raise the necessary cash. The entire process was slow, inefficient, and immensely burdensome to the population. It is true and fair to point out, as some defenders and apologists for Harthacnut have done over the centuries, and that his father Nut had levied an even larger tax when he first consolidated his conquest of England, some £72,000 in total collected in 1018, with an additional £10,500 specifically from the wealthy city of London alone. making the total around 82 or 83,000 pounds. So in purely numerical terms, Harthacnut's tax was actually quite modest compared to his father's, only about 1/4 as large. But context matters enormously in understanding why Harthacnut's tax was so much more resented and caused so much more anger than his father's had. Cnut's massive tax in 1018 had come after years of destructive warfare that had devastated parts of England, after battles and sieges and burnings that had killed thousands and destroyed enormous amounts of property and wealth. It was a one-time payment to a victorious conqueror who had defeated all opposition and established his rule through overwhelming military force. The English nobles and common people who paid that tax in 1018 understood that they were paying off an invading army, buying peace after years of war, accepting the reality of conquest. It was harsh and burdensome, but it made sense in context. This was what defeated peoples paid to victorious conquerors. But Harthacnut's tax in 1040 seemed completely different to the people who had to pay it. England was not coming out of a long, destructive war. There had been no battles, no sieges, no villages burned, no armies marching across the countryside destroying crops and property. Harold's death had been peaceful, and Harthacnut's arrival had been unopposed, and the English nobles had invited him to come and be king. From the perspective of ordinary English farmers and townspeople, they were getting their legitimate king back, the rightful heir returning to claim what should have been his all along. They weren't being conquered. They were supposedly being liberated from Harold's allegedly illegitimate rule. So why, they wondered with growing anger and resentment, were they being taxed as if they had just lost a war? Why was this enormous burden being placed on them when they had done nothing wrong, when they had welcomed their new king, when there had been no fighting or destruction that needed to be paid for? It seemed unfair, excessive, unnecessary, more like extortion than legitimate taxation, more like tribute paid to a conqueror than taxes paid to a rightful king. Moreover, and this made everything infinitely worse, the tax came at absolutely the worst possible time from the perspective of ordinary people trying to survive and feed their families. The harvest of 1040 had been poor across much of England, whether due to too much rain or too little, to disease affecting the crops, to early frosts, or to some combination of unfortunate weather conditions. The grain harvest that year, the wheat and barley and oats that formed the foundation of everyone's diet, had failed to produce the yields that farmers had hoped for and needed. Granaries that should have been full going into winter were only half full or less. Food was already becoming scarce and expensive even before Harthacnut's tax collectors arrived demanding silver. People who were already struggling to feed their families through a difficult winter, who were already rationing their grain carefully and wondering if they would have enough to last until next harvest, now faced the additional crushing burden of heavy taxation. They had to find silver somehow, had to sell what little extra grain they might have stored, had to sell livestock they needed for breeding or for milk or for ploughing, had to sell tools or cloth or other possessions, had to borrow from neighbours or from their lords at interest that they might never be able to repay. Some families probably went hungry so they could pay the king's tax collectors, choosing between feeding their children and satisfying the royal demands for silver. The contrast between the suffering of ordinary English people and the situation of Harthacnut's Danish warriors, who had to be paid substantial sums and who expected generous rewards for their service, who lived in relative comfort while English farmers starved, could not have been sharper or more bitterly resented. Here were foreign warriors, Danish men, who didn't even speak English properly, living well on silver extracted from hungry English families, getting rich off the taxes paid by people who had nothing to do with Denmark's problems or Harthacnut's need to maintain a fleet. It bred exactly the sort of ethnic and cultural resentment that could easily explode into violence under the right circumstances. But before turning his attention to the day-to-day administration and governance of his new kingdom, before dealing with the practical problems of ruling England and collecting his taxes and managing his relationship with the English nobility, Harthacnut had personal business to attend to, old scores to settle, debts of honour and vengeance that demanded satisfaction before anything else could be addressed. He had not forgotten his half-brother Alfred's brutal murder 4 years earlier in 1036. The horrific image of Alfred being captured, his Norman guard slaughtered, his eyes burned out, dying slowly and painfully at Ely. All of this had haunted Harthacnut during his years in Denmark, and his mother Emma, who had been demanding vengeance ever since that terrible day, who had spent years in exile brooding over her son's murder, who had commissioned the Encomium Emme Reginae, partly to keep the memory of Alfred's death alive, and Harold's guilt fresh in people's minds. Emma was not going to let Harthacnut forget or forgive. What Harthacnut did next to satisfy this thirst for vengeance, to pay back Harold for Alfred's death, even though Harold himself was beyond earthly punishment, shocked even a society that was quite accustomed to political violence and brutal reprisals. Medieval Europe was a violent place where wars were common, where executions were public spectacles, where traitors and criminals were subjected to elaborate tortures before death, where violence was considered a normal and acceptable part of statecraft and justice. But what Harthacnut ordered done to Harold's body went beyond normal bounds and struck many contemporaries as excessive, grotesque, almost sacrilegious. Harthacnut ordered that Harold Harefoot's body be exhumed from its place of honour in Westminster Abbey, where Harold had been buried just a few months earlier with all the ceremony and dignity appropriate for a king, laid to rest in holy ground in the great royal monastery that was already becoming England's premier site for royal burials. Harold's tomb was opened, the coffin was lifted out, and the corpse, which had been in the ground for only 3 months, so it was probably still largely intact though beginning to decompose, was dragged out into public view where everyone could see what was being done to the former king's remains. The corpse was then publicly beheaded, decapitated with an axe or sword in front of witnesses, the head separated from the body in a grotesque parody of execution, as if Harold were being executed for his crimes even though he was already dead and beyond any earthly punishment. And the symbolism was powerful and deliberate. Harold was a murderer who deserved execution, and even though death had cheated the executioner, justice would still be symbolically served by desecrating his corpse. But even this shocking act of posthumous mutilation was not the end of the desecration. The headless corpse was then disposed of in a sewer, thrown into the underground drainage system that carried away waste from the royal buildings, cast into filth and darkness, as if Harold's body itself were nothing more than garbage to be discarded. It was the ultimate insult, the complete denial of Harold's humanity and kingship, a declaration that he had been so evil, so criminal, so utterly unworthy, that his body didn't even deserve burial in unconsecrated ground, let alone in a church. But the corpse's journey wasn't finished even then. Someone, we don't know who, perhaps ordinary Londoners who were horrified by what was being done, perhaps officials who felt that even a usurper's body deserved some minimal dignity, perhaps Danish residents of London who felt some ethnic loyalty to a fellow Dane, even one who had met such a fate, retrieved the body from the sewer and threw it into the River Thames, probably hoping that the current would carry it away to the sea where it could decompose naturally, rather than rotting in the sewers of London. The body of Harold eventually washed up somewhere downstream from London, discovered by fishermen who found the headless corpse among the reeds and mud of the riverbank. Danish residents of London, perhaps feeling sympathy or perhaps simply believing that every human being deserved some kind of burial regardless of their crimes in life, had the remains collected and buried in a Danish cemetery in the city. This was probably not a church cemetery, but a burial ground used by the Danish community for their dead, consecrated ground, but not within a church building itself. Later still, after tempers had cooled and the immediate passions of vengeance had subsided somewhat, the body found its final resting place in a church in Westminster, one that would eventually become known as St. Clement Danes, a name that preserved the memory of Danish settlement in London and that served as a reminder of the Danish kings who had once ruled England. The church was said to have been originally founded by Danes in the 9th century, and it became the burial place not only of Harold, but of other Danish residents of London over the centuries. The symbolism of this grotesque treatment of Harold's corpse was extraordinarily powerful and would have been immediately understood by everyone in medieval England. In the medieval Christian worldview, the treatment of a person's body after death had tremendous significance for their soul's fate in the afterlife. An honorable burial in consecrated ground, with proper Christian rites performed by priests, with prayers said for the deceased soul, suggested that the person was worthy of salvation, that they might hope for eventual entry into heaven after whatever time they might need to spend in purgatory, being purified of their sins. To dig up a body that had been properly buried, to mutilate it, to cast it into a sewer and a river like refuse, was to declare that person utterly damned, completely unworthy of salvation, beyond any hope of redemption or mercy. It was, in effect, a declaration that Harold had been so evil, such a monster, that his very soul was condemned to hell for all eternity. Harthacnut was proclaiming to all of England and all of Christian Europe that Harold Harefoot had been not just a bad king or a usurper, but an abomination, a murderer whose crimes were so terrible that even his mortal remains deserved no respect whatsoever. This act of revenge against Harold's corpse set the tone for Harthacnut's entire reign and established his reputation as a harsh, unforgiving, vindictive ruler. This was not a king who would be conciliatory, not a ruler who would seek to heal divisions and bring his subjects together, not a monarch who believed in mercy and forgiveness and reconciliation. And this was a king who would deal harshly and brutally with those he believed had wronged him or his family, who would pursue vengeance even beyond the grave, who would use extreme violence and shocking displays of cruelty to make examples that would terrify others into submission. But Harthacnut did not stop with Harold's corpse. He also moved against the living, against those whom he held responsible for Alfred's murder, even though they were still alive and could defend themselves or plead for mercy. He brought Earl Godwin of Wessex and Lyfing, who held the positions of Bishop of Worcester and Bishop of Crediton simultaneously, which was technically against church law, but was sometimes permitted in practice, to trial for their roles in Alfred's capture and death. The trial was held publicly, probably in London or Winchester, with Harthacnut presiding personally, and other members of the royal council present as judges and witnesses. The trial was more than just a legal proceeding aimed at establishing guilt or innocence and meting out appropriate punishment. It was also, and perhaps primarily, a political spectacle, a way for Harthacnut to demonstrate to all of England that justice would be done for his murdered half-brother, that those who had participated in or facilitated Alfred's death would be held accountable, that the new king would not ignore or forget crimes committed against his family. It was theatre as much as jurisprudence, designed to impress and intimidate observers as much as to determine actual legal responsibility. Godwin, however, was a survivor, a master of political maneuvering who had thrived and prospered under multiple kings by knowing when to bend and when to stand firm, when to fight and when to submit, when to spend money and when to hold it back. He had accumulated enormous wealth during his years as Earl of Wessex, controlling vast estates that generated substantial income from rents and agricultural production. He commanded the loyalty of thousands of warriors and hundreds of lesser nobles who held land from him or who depended on his patronage. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful men in all of England, someone who could not simply be executed or imprisoned without serious political consequences. And Godwin understood that his best chance of surviving this crisis was not to claim innocence. Too many people knew that he had been involved in Alfred's capture, and denying everything would simply make him look like a liar, but rather to admit his involvement while shifting ultimate responsibility onto Harold, to claim that he had been compelled to act as he did by the king who was exercising power at that time, that he had no real choice but to obey Harold's orders or risk being destroyed himself. So Godwin came to his trial prepared not just with legal arguments, but with an impressive demonstration of his continuing power and wealth and utility to the new king. He arrived with a magnificent gift, a showpiece designed to impress and flatter and demonstrate that Godwin remained valuable, that killing or exiling him would be wasteful. The gift was a warship, not just any ordinary vessel, but one decorated and equipped in the finest possible style, with every possible luxury and military enhancement, carved and painted and gilded to be as impressive as possible. The ship carried 80 fully armed fighting men, warriors who were presumably sworn to Godwin personally, but who were being offered to Harthacnut as a demonstration of what kind of military support Godwin could provide to the king if he were kept in favour. It was a show of wealth and power, a demonstration that Godwin was still one of the most important nobles in England, despite his controversial role in Alfred's death. A reminder that Harthacnut would need powerful English nobles like Godwin to help him rule effectively and maintain order. And along with this impressive gift, Godwin swore a solemn oath, probably sworn on holy relics like saints' bones or fragments of the true cross, sworn in the presence of bishops and priests who would be witnesses to the oath's taking, that everything he had done regarding Alfred's capture and death had been on Harold's direct orders, that he had been compelled to act as he did by royal authority, that he had not wanted Alfred to be harmed, but had no choice but to obey the man who was then exercising kingly power. The combination of the expensive and impressive gift, the demonstration of Godwin's continuing military and political importance, and the solemn oath sworn with all proper religious formality, was enough to secure Godwin's acquittal and survival. Harthacnut accepted Godwin's explanation, or at least pretended to accept it, or perhaps simply recognized that destroying Godwin would be politically dangerous and strategically foolish. Godwin was allowed to keep his position as Earl of Wessex, retained his vast estates and enormous wealth, remained one of the king's most important advisors and supporters. His power and influence, so far from being diminished by the trial, were in some ways confirmed and strengthened by his successful navigation of this dangerous crisis. Whether Harthacnut truly believed Godwin's claim of innocence, whether he actually accepted that Godwin had been forced to betray Alfred against his will, is a question that historians have debated for centuries, and that we cannot answer with certainty. Some scholars think Harthacnut genuinely believed Godwin's story, and that the oath and the gift convinced him that Godwin had been Harold's unwilling tool, rather than an active conspirator. Others think Harthacnut recognized perfectly well that Godwin was probably more guilty than he claimed, but decided that pragmatic political considerations, the need for Godwin's support, the difficulty of replacing such a powerful earl, the risk of creating instability by punishing him, outweighed abstract justice and personal desire for revenge. The bishop, Lyfing, was less fortunate than Godwin, at least initially. He was temporarily stripped of his episcopal sees, losing his positions as Bishop of Worcester and Bishop of Crediton as punishment for his role in Alfred's death. But even this punishment didn't last forever. After a suitable period of penance, and probably after paying substantial fines or making generous gifts to atone for his sins, Lyfing was eventually restored to his bishoprics and resumed his ecclesiastical career. The church hierarchy, which had considerable independence from royal authority, and which didn't want to see bishops being deposed too easily by secular rulers, probably intervened on Lyfing's behalf, arguing that he deserved another chance, that he had been sufficiently punished, that forgiveness was a Christian virtue that even kings should practice. With these dramatic acts of revenge and justice completed, with Harold's corpse desecrated, and Godwin brought to trial and acquitted, and Lyfing temporarily punished, Sir Harthacnut could turn his attention to the actual business of ruling his two kingdoms, England and Denmark, managing the day-to-day administration that was the real work of kingship beyond the dramatic moments of war and punishment. He still held Denmark as well as England, making him the last king to unite those two crowns under his personal rule, the final monarch of the North Sea Empire that his father Cnut had built, but holding two kingdoms separated by hundreds of miles of often stormy and dangerous water, two realms with different languages and customs and political traditions, presented enormous and perhaps ultimately insurmountable challenges. Harthacnut's solution to the problem of ruling two kingdoms simultaneously, his strategic response to the military and administrative challenges this presented, as was to build and maintain a great fleet that could move quickly between his realms, transporting armies and officials and the king himself wherever they were needed, protecting both kingdoms from naval raids and invasions, demonstrating royal power through the impressive sight of dozens of warships sailing in formation. It was a sound strategy in theory, a reasonable response to a difficult problem, exactly the kind of thing that military strategists and political advisors would have recommended. Denmark and England were both maritime powers whose strength rested on their ability to control the seas. A strong fleet made perfect strategic sense, but fleets cost money. Ships had to be built, a process requiring skilled shipwrights and carpenters, enormous amounts of timber cut from forests and transported to shipyards, iron for nails and fittings forged by blacksmiths, rope woven from hemp or other fibers, sails sewn from wool cloth. Ships had to be maintained constantly, their hulls scraped and treated to prevent rot and barnacles, their rigging inspected and replaced, their sails mended, their wooden planks repaired or replaced when they cracked or warped. Sailors had to be hired and paid wages for their skilled labor in navigating and handling the vessels. Warriors had to be recruited and given salaries or land grants or shares of plunder to maintain their loyalty and keep them ready to fight. All of this required silver in quantities that only a kingdom's tax system could provide. And so Harthacnut raised taxes on his English subjects. As the costs continued to mount, and as he realized that maintaining both a Danish fleet and an English fleet, plus the warriors to man them, was even more expensive than he had initially calculated, he raised taxes again, and then again, imposing burden after burden on a population that was already struggling with the after effects of poor harvests and food shortages. The Heir, that tax originally instituted by Ethelred the Unready decades earlier to pay armies that would fight the Vikings or pay off Viking raiders to make them go away, was increased to levels that England had not seen since the darkest and most desperate days of the Viking raids of the 990s and early thousands. Some sources suggest that Harthacnut doubled the size of his combined fleet from 16 to 32 ships, a massive expansion that required corresponding increases in funding to build the new ships and maintain them and pay their crews. Whether this figure of 32 ships refers to his entire fleet across both kingdoms or just to some particular squadron or deployment, the sources don't make entirely clear, but the overall picture is consistent. Harthacnut was building ships on a large scale and taxing England heavily to pay for them. The English people, already suffering from poor harvests and heavy taxation, found themselves squeezed harder and harder as royal tax collectors came again and again, demanding more silver, more payment for the king's ships and the king's warriors. The coins flowed steadily and remorselessly from villages and towns across England into the king's treasury, and moved from there to shipbuilders and suppliers and warriors, all to support a military establishment that seemed endlessly hungry for resources that could never be satisfied no matter how much silver was poured into it. Adding significantly to the resentment and anger that was building throughout England was the fundamental style and character of Harthacnut's rule, the way he approached the actual practice of kingship and made decisions. In Denmark, he had governed autocratically, making decisions himself without much consultation or need for consensus, issuing orders that were expected to be obeyed without question or discussion. This was the Danish style of kingship, the way his father Cnut had ruled Denmark, the way Danish kings had always ruled, with personal authority and direct command, or with less emphasis on councils and consultation and consensus building. But England had developed a rather different tradition of kingship over the centuries, one that emphasized at least the appearance and often the reality of consultation and shared decision-making. English kings, even strong and dominant ones like Cnut when he ruled England, had typically governed in consultation with the Witan, an assembly of leading nobles and bishops and abbots and other important figures who met regularly to advise the king, to witness important royal decisions, to help settle major disputes, to discuss policy and legislation. The Witan didn't control the king or limit his power in any formal constitutional sense. Medieval England wasn't a democracy or a limited monarchy in the modern sense, but it was a forum where the king listened to advice and built consensus, and demonstrated that he was ruling with the support and cooperation of his subjects, rather than purely through fear and force. Decisions about war or peace, about major changes in law or taxation, about the succession or other crucial matters would typically be made in consultation with the Witan. The king would present an issue. Nobles and bishops would offer their opinions and advice. Debate might occur about the best course of action, and eventually a decision would be reached that represented something like consensus, even if it was ultimately the king's choice. This consultative process served several important purposes. It gave powerful nobles a stake in royal decisions and made them more likely to support and implement those decisions. It tapped into the collective wisdom and local knowledge of men who understood conditions in their own regions, and it made the king's decisions seem more legitimate and justified because they had been discussed and agreed upon by the kingdom's leading men, rather than simply imposed by royal fiat. Harthacnut showed little interest in this English tradition of consultative governance. He had ruled Denmark without needing to constantly seek advice and build consensus among Danish nobles, and he saw no reason to change his methods, now that he was also ruling England. He appeared to view the English expectation of consultation and council meetings as weakness, as an unnecessary limitation on royal authority, as something that would slow down decision-making and make it harder to act decisively. He distrusted many of the English earls, perhaps with some good reason given the role that some of them had played in supporting Harold Harefoot against him, given the complicated and murky circumstances of Alfred's death. given the general uncertainty about who could be trusted and who might be plotting against him. So Harthacnut ruled England as he had ruled Denmark, autocratically, issuing orders and expecting immediate obedience, relying on intimidation and displays of force rather than on consultation and compromise and the building of cooperative relationships with his nobility. He made decisions by himself, or with only a very small circle of close advisors, and mostly Danish warriors and officials who had come with him from Denmark, and who shared his cultural assumptions about how kingship should work. He didn't bother much with Witan meetings or with seeking the advice of English nobles, who might have helped him understand English customs and sensibilities, and who might have warned him about policies that would create resentment and resistance. This autocratic style of rule, this refusal to work within English political traditions, combined with the crushing and ever-increasing taxation to create a powder keg of resentment and anger that was building throughout England. People resented the high taxes, resented the foreign Danish warriors who were living comfortably on silver extracted from hungry English families, resented being ruled by a king who didn't listen to them or care about their concerns or respect their traditions. They grumbled and complained in their homes and in market squares and in churches after services, keeping their voices low when tax collectors or royal officials were nearby, but speaking more freely when they felt safe from being overheard and reported. But resentment and quiet grumbling, as long as they remained just words without action, posed no real threat to Harthacnut's rule. Kings throughout history have been resented and complained about without facing serious challenges to their authority. What turned resentment into active resistance, what transformed grumbling into rebellion, was a specific incident in a specific place, where the accumulated anger and frustration finally boiled over into violence. And that place was the city of Worcester, in the English Midlands, in the spring of 1041. Worcester was a significant city in the Kingdom of Mercia, one of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that had been joined together to form England. It sat on the River Severn, an important transportation route that connected the interior of England to the Bristol Channel and the sea. It was a centre of trade and commerce where merchants bought and sold goods, where craftsmen worked in their shops, where farmers from the surrounding countryside brought their produce to sell at market. Most importantly for our story, it was home to a cathedral, a great church that served as the seat of the Bishop of Worcester, one of the most important ecclesiastical positions in England. When Harthacnut's tax collectors arrived in Worcester in early May of 1041, coming to demand silver to fund the king's fleet-building program and pay his Danish warriors, they found a population that had been pushed beyond its breaking point. People who had simply had enough of the constant demands for more and more money, who were angry and desperate and ready to resist, even though they knew that resistance could bring terrible consequences. The tax collectors were two men whose names have been preserved in the chronicles as Fida and Thurston, though some sources spell the second name as Thurston. They were royal officials, men appointed by the king or his ministers to go throughout England, collecting the taxes that had been assessed on each region, carrying the authority of the king, but not necessarily accompanied by large numbers of armed warriors to enforce their demands. And tax collection in medieval England relied primarily on the authority and legitimacy of the royal government, on people's habit of obedience to royal commands, on the assumption that the king's orders would and must be obeyed because he was the king. Violence against tax collectors was extremely rare because it was understood by everyone that attacking or killing the king's officials would bring devastating royal vengeance on the entire community. But the mood in Worcester in May 1041 was ugly and dangerous. These were not people calmly accepting royal authority and paying their taxes with resigned obedience. These were desperate, angry people who felt they had been pushed too far, who saw their families going hungry while foreign warriors lived in comfort, who resented being squeezed for every penny they had or could borrow. When Feeder and Thurston began demanding payment, began insisting that Worcester and the surrounding countryside must produce their share of the king's tax, the reaction was not compliance, but hostility. On Monday, May 4th, 1041, the simmering tension in Worcester erupted into open violence. The citizens of Worcester, driven by a combination of desperation, hunger, and righteous anger at what they saw as unjust and unbearable taxation, rose up in rebellion against the king's authority. It was an extraordinarily dangerous and risky thing to do. Everyone knew that attacking the king's representatives was treason, that it would bring terrible royal vengeance, but they had been pushed beyond the point where caution and fear could restrain them. Feeder and Thurston, sensing the danger growing around them, seeing the angry crowds gathering, hearing the muttered threats and curses, attempted to flee and find safety. They ran to the monastery that stood in Worcester, that great religious house attached to the cathedral, hoping desperately that the sanctity of holy ground would protect them, that even an angry mob would hesitate to violate a monastery and drag men from their refuge in a sacred place. They managed to reach one of the monastery's towers, climbing up into the height where they thought they might be safe, where the narrow stairs and thick walls might protect them from the pursuing crowd. But the mob was beyond caring about the sanctity of churches or the sin of violating holy ground. Their anger had reached a point where religious prohibitions meant nothing compared to their rage and desperation. The crowd stormed into the monastery and pushed past any monks who tried to stop them, climbed the tower stairs, and dragged Feeder and Thurston from their hiding place. And there, probably in the monastery courtyard, or perhaps in the street outside, the two tax collectors were murdered by the mob, beaten or stabbed or struck down in a frenzy of violence that released all the accumulated resentment and anger of months of crushing taxation and hunger. It was an act of open defiance against royal authority, an inexcusable crime by medieval legal standards, something that no king could possibly ignore without appearing weak and losing control over his kingdom. When news of the murders reached Harthacnut, wherever he was at the time, probably in Winchester or London, the main centres of royal power, his response was swift, decisive, and absolutely brutal. He would make an example of Worcester that would terrify every other city and town in England, that would demonstrate beyond any doubt what happened to communities that dared to resist royal authority and murder the king's officials. Harthacnut ordered what was known in medieval legal terminology as a harrying of Worcester and Worcestershire, the city and the surrounding county. This was actually a recognised legal punishment under English and Danish law, used against rebellious territories or communities that had committed serious offences against royal authority. But legal or not, it was harsh almost beyond modern imagination, devastating in its scope and severity. Harthacnut instructed his earls, probably including Earl Leofric of Mercia, and in whose territory Worcester lay, to take a substantial military force to Worcester and utterly devastate it. The city was to be burned, its buildings destroyed, its wealth seized or destroyed, and its population killed or driven away as punishment for their rebellion and murder of the king's men. The people of Worcester, hearing through messengers and travellers that the king's army was assembling and marching toward their city, knew exactly what was coming. They had no illusions about their chances of defending the city against a royal army. They were merchants and craftsmen and farmers, not professional warriors. They had no walls strong enough to resist a siege, no weapons or armour sufficient to fight trained soldiers, no hope whatsoever of military victory against the forces Harthacnut was sending. Their only chance of survival was to flee before the army arrived, to abandon their homes and businesses and possessions and run to wherever they might find safety. And that is exactly what most of them did. The great majority of Worcester's population, men, women, children, carrying whatever portable possessions they could manage, driving livestock before them, pushing carts loaded with goods, streamed out of the city before Harthacnut's army arrived. Many went to Bever Island, a small island in the River Severn near Worcester, hoping that the water surrounding it would provide some protection, that the army might not bother to cross over to the island, or might not have boats sufficient to transport troops there. Others scattered into the countryside, fleeing to villages or forests where they hoped to hide until the danger passed, are seeking shelter with relatives, or simply running blindly away from the approaching destruction. When Harthacnut's forces finally arrived at Worcester, they found a city that was largely empty, abandoned, almost deserted. Most of the population was gone, deprived of the victims they had come to punish. Unable to exact vengeance directly on the people who had murdered the tax collectors, the soldiers turned their fury on the city itself and everything in it. Worcester was systematically set ablaze. Houses were torched, their thatched roofs catching fire easily and burning quickly, timber frames collapsing in the heat. The cathedral and monastery, despite being holy ground, were damaged, whether deliberately burned or just caught in the general conflagration. The sources don't make entirely clear. Then shops and storehouses were looted first and then burned. Anything of value that could be carried away was seized as plunder by the soldiers. Everything else was destroyed. The army ravaged the countryside around Worcester as well, not limiting their destruction to the city itself, but spreading out across Worcestershire to punish the entire region. Fields were burned, destroying the crops that had been planted, and that would have fed the population through the coming year. Livestock that couldn't be driven off as plunder was slaughtered and left to rot. Farm buildings were burned. The devastation was systematic and thorough, designed to ensure that Worcester and its region would suffer for years from this punishment, that recovery would be slow and painful, that the lesson would not be forgotten by anyone in England. The army then approached Bever Island, where hundreds or perhaps thousands of refugees had gathered. Terrified families huddled together on that small piece of land surrounded by water, watching the smoke rising from their burning city across the river, knowing that the soldiers would eventually come for them. But here something unexpected happened, something that the sources describe only vaguely and that historians have interpreted in various ways. Rather than launching an assault that would have been a massacre, rather than crossing to the island and slaughtering everyone there, as might have been expected, given the brutal tone of everything else that had happened, the army somehow was pacified or turned back, or decided not to proceed with the final act of vengeance. Perhaps the sheer number of refugees made an assault seem too costly in terms of soldiers' lives. Perhaps local nobles like Leofric, who had to live in this region and maintain order after the royal army left, negotiated some arrangement to spare the civilians. Perhaps the soldiers, having already burned the city and ravaged the countryside and seized considerable plunder, felt their honor was satisfied and their orders fulfilled without needing to commit wholesale slaughter of unarmed civilians. Perhaps money changed hands, bribes paid to spare the refugees. We simply don't know because the chronicles don't provide detailed explanation. What we know is that the people on Bever Island were spared the massacre they had feared. Eventually, after the royal army departed and the immediate danger passed, they could return to what remained of Worcester and begin the long, painful, heartbreaking process of rebuilding their lives from the ruins. But the city had been devastated, an enormous amount of wealth destroyed, countless families impoverished, and the memory of what had happened would last for generations. The destruction of Worcester sent shockwaves throughout England. The message was received loud and clear in every city and village. Resist the king's authority, harm his officials, and you will see everything you have built destroyed, everything you own taken or burned, your entire community devastated. It was governance through terror, rule by fear, and it made Harthacnut even more hated and despised than he already was. But it was effective in the short term. There would be no more rebellions during his reign, and no more tax collectors murdered, no more open defiance of royal commands. The Worcester incident was not the only example of Harthacnut's harsh rule. In Northumbria, in the far north of England, there was a powerful nobleman named Eadwulf, who held the title of Earl of Bernicia, and who served as head of the important Bamberg family. Eadwulf was in some ways a semi-independent ruler in his region, wielding more real practical power in Northumbria than the distant king in Winchester could directly exercise, commanding the loyalty of thousands of warriors and lesser nobles who looked to Bamberg for leadership. At some point during 1041, Eadwulf came to Harthacnut's court, apparently seeking reconciliation for some offence or attempting to negotiate some political arrangement. What exactly he hoped to achieve, we cannot say. The sources preserve only the outcome, not the motivations or negotiations that led to it. But Harthacnut, looking at this powerful northern earl who commanded armies almost independently, saw not a loyal subject seeking peace, but a potential threat, a man who held too much power without royal oversight, who might become a rebel or a rival if not dealt with decisively and permanently. Harthacnut ordered Eadwulf murdered, instructing another northern earl named Cnut to carry out the execution. Eadwulf was killed, struck down by Cnut's men, eliminated as a political force. To the people of Northumbria, who revered the Bamberg family and who had respected Eadwulf's authority and leadership, this was an act of treachery and oath-breaking of the worst sort. Eadwulf had come seeking peace and had been rewarded with death. He had trusted in the king's safe conduct and had been betrayed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that remarkable year-by-year record of English history that was kept by monks throughout the kingdom, captured the outrage and contempt in its entry for this event. It described Eadwulf's murder as a betrayal, and it called Harthacnut an oath-breaker, one of the worst insults that could be levelled at a medieval king, for a king's word was supposed to be sacred and unbreakable. The Chronicle went further, delivering what amounted to a damning verdict on Harthacnut's entire reign. He never accomplished anything kingly for as long as he ruled. It was an extraordinarily harsh assessment, essentially saying that Harthacnut had completely failed at the most basic requirements of kingship, and that his reign had been worthless and without merit or achievement. Yet amid all this oppression, violence and failure, Harthacnut made one decision in 1041 that would prove to be his most important and lasting legacy, though he could not possibly have known it at the time. He invited his half-brother Edward back to England from Normandy, where Edward had been living in exile since childhood. Edward, the son of Emma and Ethelred the Unready, was now approaching 40 years old. His entire adult life spent away from England in his mother's homeland across the Channel. Harthacnut welcomed Edward with genuine warmth and treated him with honour and respect. Perhaps influenced by Emma, perhaps recognizing that he had no children of his own and needed to designate a clear heir, and perhaps simply feeling familial affection for this half-brother he barely knew, Harthacnut designated Edward as his successor to the English throne. When Harthacnut died, and though he was still young, his health was apparently fragile, marked by recurring bouts of illness. England would pass back to the old Anglo-Saxon line, the descendants of Alfred the Great and the House of Wessex. And so, the months of late 1041 and early 1042 passed slowly, with England enduring under its unpopular Danish king. People paid their taxes resentfully, but paid them nonetheless. They grumbled about Harthacnut's harshness, but were careful not to speak too loudly. Life went on as it always does, even under oppression, with farmers planting and harvesting, merchants trading, craftsmen working at their trades, children being born, and old people dying, and the endless cycle of human existence continuing regardless of politics and kings. Then came June of 1042, and with it one of those moments that changed the course of history in an instant, as sudden and unexpected as a lightning strike from a clear sky. On June 8th, 1042, a wedding celebration was being held in Lambeth, just across the River Thames from Westminster. The groom was Tovey the Proud, who had served Harthacnut's father Cnut faithfully for years as a standard-bearer and then. The bride was Githa, daughter of another Then named Osgod Klapa. It was a festive occasion, a joyous celebration bringing together Danish and English nobility, a chance to forget the kingdom's troubles for a day and simply celebrate love and new beginnings. King Harthacnut attended the wedding, as was appropriate for a king honouring loyal retainers. The feast was lavish with roasted meats, fresh bread, fish, fruits, honey cakes. Wine and ale and mead flowed freely, and everyone was in high spirits. The young king, never one to refuse drink, partook heartily of the celebration, raising his cup again and again in various toasts. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration reached its height, Harthacnut stood to offer a formal toast to the bride and groom. It was a moment of ceremony and joy, the king honouring the newlyweds with his words, wishing them happiness and prosperity in their life together. Harthacnut raised his drinking horn, opened his mouth to speak the traditional words of blessing, and then suddenly, without any warning, he stopped. The words died on his lips. His body convulsed violently. The drinking horn fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle preserves the dramatic moment. Harthacnut died as he stood at his drink, and he suddenly fell to the earth with an awful convulsion. And those who were close by took hold of him, and he spoke no word afterwards. The celebration transformed instantly into chaos and horror. Guests rushed forward, trying to catch the falling king, to help him, to understand what was happening. But Harthacnut could not speak, could not respond, could not even seem to recognize what was happening to him. Whatever had struck him down had done so with terrible, absolute swiftness. They carried him to a bed, laid him down with what care could be given. Perhaps priests were summoned to administer last rites, but nothing could save him. Harthacnut died there in Lambeth, still at the wedding feast, but never having spoken another word after his collapse. He was only 23 or 24 years old. His reign as King of England had lasted barely 2 years. His life, which had begun with such magnificent promise as heir to the greatest empire in Northern Europe, had ended suddenly at a moment when he should have been celebrating life and joy. What killed him? The suddenness, the convulsion, the inability to speak. These symptoms suggest a catastrophic medical event. Most historians believe he suffered a stroke, perhaps brought on by excessive drinking combined with underlying health problems. He had been known for heavy drinking throughout his reign, and he had suffered from mysterious bouts of illness even before coming to England. A stroke would explain everything: the sudden collapse, the convulsion, the inability to speak, as the rapid death. Some whispered of poison, for Harthacnut had made many enemies, but no source provides real evidence, and the symptoms seem more consistent with stroke than with the poisons available in the 11th century. Other possibilities, epileptic seizure, heart attack, aneurysm, have been suggested by medical historians, but we will likely never know for certain. What we know is the result. Harthacnut was dead. his brief troubled reign over, his life cut short just as he was entering what should have been his prime. The North Sea Empire died with him. Denmark would go to Magnus of Norway, fulfilling their treaty. England would go to Edward, fulfilling Harthacnut's designation. The dream of uniting England and Scandinavia under one crown was finished forever. Harthacnut was buried at Winchester Cathedral in the Old Minster, and next to his father Nut, two Danish kings of England, side by side, one remembered as Nut the Great, the other barely remembered at all except as England's last Danish king, whose reign accomplished nothing and whose death was almost a relief to his suffering subjects. His mother Emma, who had worked so hard to secure his throne, now found herself grieving another son. She gave the head of St. Valentine to the new minster for Harthacnut's soul, hoping that despite his harsh rule, he might find mercy in the afterlife. Edward succeeded smoothly, and the Anglo-Saxon line was restored. Danish rule in England was over forever. Within 24 years, William the Conqueror would bring Norman rule, but that is another story for another time. As we drift towards sleep together, let us consider Harthacnut's legacy with gentle understanding. Yes, he was a harsh king who taxed heavily and ruled cruelly. Yes, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's assessment was damning. He never accomplished anything kingly for as long as he ruled. But he was also a young man who never had a chance to mature, who inherited an impossible situation, who was only 23 when he died. Born to privilege, he lived much of his life in isolation in Denmark. He witnessed violence and betrayal from childhood. He spent 5 years trying to reach an inheritance being stolen from him. When he finally gained his throne, he had only 2 years before death took him. Perhaps, if he had lived longer, he might have learned wisdom. Perhaps he might have become a better king. We will never know. Instead, his story is one of wasted potential, of a life cut short before it could truly begin, of an empire that died with its builder's son. And now, dear listener, as the story of England's last Danish king draws to its gentle close, let it carry you softly into sleep. The 11th century fades into distant memory, its struggles and sorrows dissolving into dreams. May you rest more peacefully than Harthacnut ever did. May your sleep be gentle and your dreams be kind. Thank you for joining me tonight on Sleepy Crown. If you enjoyed this peaceful journey through history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel for more soothing historical tales, and leave a comment about which historical figure you'd like to explore next. Until we meet again in another peaceful tale, sleep well, dear listener. May your rest be deep, your dreams be sweet, and may you wake refreshed when morning comes. Good night, and sweet dreams.